Welcome to At Midnight, the late night dive into history, myths, and legends. We're unraveling the entire tangled family tree of the ancient Egyptian pantheon, from the primordial chaos of the Nun to the very last word on why the gods abandoned us to our own toil. This is At Midnight. Let's step into the dark. It's tempting to picture the beginning as a dramatic explosion, but the Egyptians imagined something far less cinematic. Before anything, before gods, before dirt, before time itself had a name, there was the Nun. Not an ocean you could drown in, not a sea with waves, but an infinite dark expanse of inert water, absolutely still, absolutely silent, the total absence of form or thought. The kind of place that would make a sensory deprivation tank feel like a bustling marketplace. No light, no movement, just a boundless, pitch-black, wet nothing that had always been there. And then, without a reason anyone bothered to write down, something solid simply appeared. A little hill of silt and stone pushed itself up from the watery chaos, the first piece of dry land in existence. This was the primeval mound, called the Benben, a word that sounds almost comically simple for such a monumental thing. But that was the point. It was the first thing that was a thing, perched right at the spot where the temple of Heliopolis would one day stand. Or so the priests insisted. This mound became the axis of all reality. On that mound, the very first sunrise ever broke. Imagine a sun that didn't yet exist, rising over a world that didn't yet exist, shining on a lump of mud that had no business being there. That sunbeam, that first defiant flash of light striking the Benben, was the signal that creation had officially started. It didn't just illuminate the darkness. It somehow made the darkness realize it had been dark. And waiting right there, already present on that mound, as if the sunlight had sculpted him from the silence, was the first god. That first god was Atum, and by all accounts, his arrival was less of a grand entrance and more of an awkward realization that he was completely alone on a mud hill in the dark. The name Atum means the complete one, which has a nice ring of self-sufficiency, until you remember that being complete in an endless void just means there's nobody to talk to. He arose from the Nun fully formed, self-created, which is a polite way of saying he had no parents, no childhood, and absolutely no instruction manual for what to do next. The Heliopolitan priests, working out of the Sun Temple at what is now a suburb of modern Cairo, recorded what happened next with admirable frankness. Atum, embodying both the male and female principles within a single being, performed the first act of creation entirely by himself. In the most widely circulated version, that act was masturbation. In another telling, equally authoritative, he spat. The Egyptians saw no contradiction here. Both were ways to bring something out of the body that then became separate and alive. From that divine emission emerged Shu, the god of dry air and empty space, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and mist. They were the first gendered pair, meaning the universe had just invented the concept of a couple by accident, and Atum was suddenly a father. This whole performance wasn't ambition or a grand design. It was loneliness. The texts are clear that Atum created because he was tired of his own company, a motivation that feels startlingly human for a cosmic being. The moment Shu and Tefnut materialized, the nun probably felt a little less oppressive, because now there was someone else to share the silence. Of course, the two of them promptly wandered off into the darkness, causing Atum to send his fiery eye out searching for them. But that is a story for later. With Shu and Tefnut, the foundation of the great Ennead was laid. An Ennead is simply a company of 9 gods, from the Greek word for 9, though the Egyptians were never fussy about keeping the head count precise. Atum sat at the top as the solitary source, and from him descended a chain of deities that would explain every major force in the cosmos. It was a family tree that started with one very lonely god on a very small island, proving that even omnipotence cannot fix a lack of conversation. Shu and Tefnut were not simply the first pair of siblings with an absent father. They were walking, breathing cosmic principles forced into existence to solve the problem of an undifferentiated universe. Before them, everything was the nun one big, wet, monotonous soup. There was no distinction between damp and dry, light and dark, here and there. Then Shu arrived as the god of dry air, light, and empty space, which is a fancy way of saying he was the living embodiment of a gap. He wasn't the air you breathe. He was the space that air occupies, the dryness that makes fire possible, the transparency that allows light to travel. Tefnut, his twin, was the goddess of moisture, mist, and the kind of order that curls up in dewdrops at dawn. She was the wetness that gives the air something to push against, the humidity that reminds you the primordial waters haven't gone far. Their very birth tore the primeval unity in half, which was the point. For a structured world to exist, you cannot have everything mixed into a single infinite blob. You need contrasts. Shu and Tefnut were those first contrasts, the original binary code of creation. They made it possible to say, this is here, that is there, to have a dry spot where a sun could rise, and a misty horizon where it could set. Without them, the cosmos would have remained a formless concept, a thought experiment in Atum's lonely mind. And because Egyptian theology treats family reunions as cosmic events, these two abstract principles did what abstract principles always do in myth. They became the parents of something much more solid, namely the earth and the sky. That earth was Jeb, and that sky was Nut. The moment the two of them came into existence, they locked onto each other with a gravitational desperation that made up for eons of cosmic loneliness. Jeb stretched himself flat on his back, his body forming the mountains and plains, his ribs the ridges of the desert, his laughter the rumble of earthquakes. Nut arched herself over him like a woman trying to shield a secret, her belly painted with what would eventually become stars. her fingers and toes touching the horizons. They were utterly inseparable, pressed together so tightly that not a whisper of air could slip between them. It sounds romantic, this eternal embrace, until you realize it was also a logistical catastrophe. There was no space for anything else. No light could travel between them, no breeze could stir, no river could flow. The world was a closed sandwich of divine affection, and creation had ground to a claustrophobic halt. All the ingredients for life were present, the solid ground, the protective canopy, but they were smothering each other, their union so complete that it refused to admit the existence of a third thing. It was the ultimate expression of potential, and also the ultimate expression of overdoing it. The Egyptians understood that sometimes, for life to begin, a perfect bond has to be shattered. Geb and Nut represented everything the cosmos needed to thrive, but only if someone pried them apart. So there they remained, locked in a static, silent, world-crushing hug, blissfully unaware that their happiness was the biggest obstacle the universe had yet faced. Something was going to have to come between them, and given the family tree, it was obvious who would get the job. That someone was their own father, Shu, the god of dry air and empty space, who had been waiting for purpose ever since his own awkward birth from Atum's solitude. If you ever wondered what a midlife crisis looks like for a cosmic principle, it turns out it looks like prying your children apart with your bare hands. Shu stepped directly into the impossible gap between Geb and Nut, planted his feet on the earth god's torso, and pushed upward with both arms against the sky goddess's belly. The sound of that separation must have been the first noise the world ever heard. Nut arched away from her lover, her body stretching into a vast blue dome, her starry skin pulled taut like a curtain across infinity. Geb reached up, his mountains straining toward her, his tectonic plates grinding with the effort of holding on. But Shu held firm, his arms locked straight, his body becoming the pillar of atmosphere, the living column of breathable space that would forever stand between the ground and the clouds. In temple art, this moment is frozen forever. Shu, often shone with feathers in his hair, holding Nut aloft while Geb reclines beneath him, forever separated, forever yearning. And the yearning was the point. The Egyptians did not pretend the separation was a clean break. Geb and Nut longed for each other with an ache that rippled through the natural world. Earthquakes were Geb shuddering in frustration. Dew was Nut's tears falling onto her lover's skin. The horizon was the place where they almost, but never quite, could touch. Still, the brutal intervention worked. Air now circulated. Light could travel. The space between earth and sky became the great stage where life would unfold. There was finally enough room for something to happen, and enough distance for those happenings to matter. That space filled almost immediately with the children of Geb and Nut, 5 deities whose family drama would become the central nervous system of Egyptian myth. Their names were Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and sometimes Horus the Elder, depending on which priest was counting. These 5, together with their 4 ancestors, formed the great Ennead of Heliopolis, a tidy set of 9 gods that the theologians treated as a kind of cosmic periodic table. Atum sat at the head as the lonely source, followed by Shu and Tefnut, then Jeb and Nut, and finally, this new generation of divine personalities who would do more to shape the human experience than any abstract principle of air or moisture ever could. But there is a catch, and the catch is time itself. The birth of these 5 did not happen on ordinary days. In fact, their very existence required a loophole in the calendar, a secret stretch of hours smuggled into the year by a moon god and a scribe playing games with fate. These were the 5 epigomenal days, days that belonged to no month, wedged between the end of one year and the start of the next, like a crack in time's door. On those 5 strange days, Nut gave birth sequentially to Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys, each arriving on a day that technically should not have existed. The full roster of the Ennead now stood complete, or as complete as anything ever got in Egyptian theology. 9 gods: Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Jeb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Some lists slipped Horus the Elder in there too, nudging the count to 10, because the Egyptians were never going to let a nice round number ruin a good story. What mattered was that the key players were now on the board. Osiris the king, Isis the sorceress, Set the storm, and Nephthys the shadow were not distant cosmic forces, but personalities with motives, rivalries, and a talent for catastrophe that would define everything that followed. But while the family of Atum was busy inventing personality and conflict on their muddy little mound, a completely different origin story was running in parallel, cooked up by the priests downriver at a place called Hermopolis, a city known today as El Ashmanine. Their version of creation had no lonely god, no dramatic self-discovery, no awkward father-son confrontations. It was more like a chemistry experiment run by frogs and snakes. The Hermopolitan Ogdoad was a set of 8 primordial deities, an Ogdoad being simply an 8-fold company. They existed not as individuals with backstories and grudges, but as paired principles, 4 couples floating in the none like ingredients waiting to react. Each male deity had the head of a frog, each female the head of a snake, which tells you immediately that the Egyptians were not designing these beings for aesthetic appeal. They were designing them for meaning. Frogs were creatures of the mud that appeared after the flood, symbols of spontaneous life. Snakes were ancient, chthonic, the movers in darkness. The 4 pairs divided the formless chaos into 4 elemental domains. Nun and Nonnet were the water itself, the original wet infinite. Heh and Hahit were infinity, the boundless extent of space and time that makes you dizzy to think about. Kek and Cocket were darkness, the absolute black that existed before any light source was invented. And Amun and Amenet were hiddenness, the principle of being unseen and unknowable, which is a bold thing to name as a deity, since naming it makes it slightly less hidden by definition. Together these 8 drifted in the inert waters, not creating through will or loneliness, but simply existing with such concentration that their combined energy eventually triggered something. The waters churned, a mound pushed up, and from that mound emerged either a cosmic egg or a blooming lotus, depending on the telling, carrying the newborn sun. The contrast with the Heliopolitan story is striking and deliberate. Atum acted out of emotion and need. The Ogdoad acted out of elemental pressure. One model gave you gods with feelings. The other gave you a universe that simply had to happen. And if the Ogdoad of Hermopolis felt a little too much like a physics lecture, the priests of Memphis had a third answer entirely. One that was elegant, intellectual, and quietly devastating in its implications. Their creator was Ta, the god of craftsmen, and unlike Atum, he did not resort to bodily fluids. And unlike the Ogdoad, he did not need a partner or a primordial soup to react. Ta simply thought the world into being and then spoke it aloud. That was it. No drama, no loneliness, no frogs. The Memphite theology, preserved on a worn slab of stone called the Shabaka stone that now sits in the British Museum, describes a process so sophisticated it almost sounds like philosophy. Ta conceived the entire universe in his heart, which the Egyptians understood as the seat of intelligence, not emotion. Once the idea was fully formed, he pronounced it with his tongue, and the words became things. Every god, every mountain, every river, every scuttling beetle was first a sentence in the mind of Ta, and then a reality the moment he said its name. Creation was not a physical act. It was a linguistic one. This made Ta the patron of all craftsmen, architects, sculptors, and anyone who ever had an idea, and then made it real with their hands. The act of making a chair or carving a statue was a miniature echo of divine creation, a little Ta moment in the workshop. It also meant that Ta had already thought of and spoken into existence Atum, the Ogdoad, and everyone else before they even had the chance to claim they were first. The Memphites had quietly one-upped every other priesthood in Egypt by arguing that their god was the mind behind all the other gods, the original intellect that predated even the primordial waters. No fists, no spit, no eggs. Just thought, just words, just a god who understood that the most powerful thing in the universe is an idea with the will to speak it. But while Ta was proving that words were the sharpest tools in the cosmos, a city far to the south, Thebes, modern Luxor, had been quietly developing a god who took the concept of hiddenness to its most extreme conclusion. His name was Amun, which literally means the hidden one. And if the Memphites had cornered the market on intellectual creation, the Thebans responded by arguing that the real supreme being could not be seen, heard, named, or even properly imagined. He was the invisible force behind every force, the unseen mind behind every mind, so transcendent that even describing him felt like an act of slander. Amun had a small but crucial cameo in the Hermopolitan Ogdoad as one of the 8 primordial deities, the male half of the pair that embodied hiddenness. But in the hands of the Theban priests, he outgrew that modest role like a hermit crab, upgrading to an entire empire. They declared that Amun was not merely a member of the Ogdoad, but the power that animated the entire Ogdoad from the shadows, the secret will that caused the 8 frog and snake gods to stir the waters in the first place. He was self-created, without mother or father, his own origin, which is a theological way of saying he simply was. No dramatic emergence on a mound, no bodily fluids, no spoken word. Just a profound, unnerving silence that had always been there, containing everything. This made Amun simultaneously the most important god in the universe and the most frustrating one to worship. How do you build a relationship with a deity defined by being unknowable? The answer, it turned out, was to declare that his hiddenness and the visible sun were 2 sides of the same coin. The Theban priests began to weave Amun together with Ra, that other self-created solar deity whose messy family drama we have not even gotten to yet. The fusion would produce Amun-Ra, the hidden sun, the invisible visible, a theological masterstroke that would eventually make Thebes the most powerful religious center in Egypt, and Amun-Ra the undisputed king of the gods. The moment a culture concludes that the heavens have an undisputed king, someone will inevitably look around the throne room and ask why the earth does not have the same arrangement. The answer Egypt settled on was elegant, absolute, and deeply strange. The pharaoh was not merely a man who wore a crown. He was, at every moment of his reign, the living incarnation of Horus on earth. Horus was the falcon-headed prince of divine vengeance, the son of Osiris and Isis, who had not yet fought his famous battle for the throne, but whose mythic shadow already stretched backward across time to sanctify every coronation. This meant that the pharaoh was also the son of Ra, the physical child of the sun god, although the biology of that arrangement was left deliberately vague. The theology was not concerned with literal reproduction. It was concerned with a channel of light and authority that poured directly from the solar bark into the palace. When a pharaoh died, he did not simply vanish. He became Osiris, the murdered king who transformed into the lord of the underworld. And the moment the old king's heart stopped, his heir became the new Horus, stepping onto the throne as the avenger and legitimate son. The entire machinery of dynastic succession was thus a replay of a cosmic drama that the gods had already performed in mythic time, a loop of death, resurrection, and filial duty that made every transition of power a holy act rather than a political gamble. There was a deeper layer still. The Egyptians believed that kingship was not just a job, but a divine force, a royal ka, a life energy double passed from one body to the next, as if the crown itself had a soul. The pharaoh carried the accumulated power of every ruler before him, a chain of celestial fire that could not be broken without unmaking the world. This doctrine meant that the squabbling gods in the Ennead and the eventual 80-year courtroom brawl between Horus and Set were not just entertaining family gossip. They were the original constitutional crisis, the mythic precedent for every succession, and every claim to legitimacy that would ever be debated in the halls of Egyptian power. And the celestial divine force upon which all those earthly claims of kingship ultimately depended was Ra, the sun, the blindingly obvious center of everything. He was not a hidden god, not a craftsman working in silence, not a frog-headed abstraction. Ra was the golden disk burning across the daytime sky, a presence so self-evident that his worship needed no elaborate origin story to justify it. He simply was, and everything else lived because he did. His daily commute was a masterpiece of cosmic theater. Each morning, Ra boarded his day bark, the Manjet, a celestial boat that sailed the blue river of the sky from east to west. He was born at dawn, a red infant crawling over the horizon. By midday, he was a warrior in full armor, pouring light down onto the fields and temples, his heat the engine that made crops grow and hearts beat. By evening, he was an old man, bent and weary, sinking toward the western mountains where the sky swallowed him. The Egyptians watched this happen every single day of their lives and understood it as both a guarantee and a warning. The sun would return, yes, but only after a death. At night, Ra transferred to the night bark, the Mesiktet, and sailed into the Juet, the underworld, a place we will get to in due time, and which makes a midnight stroll through a bad neighborhood look like a holiday. His goal was to survive 12 hours of darkness, battle a serpent that wanted to unmake reality, and emerge reborn on the eastern horizon. The entire rhythm of existence, the breathing of temples, the timing of offerings, the legitimacy of kings, all of it hung on this single, fragile cycle. Ra was the creator-maintainer, the source not just of light, but of the repeated, reliable pattern that kept the world from sliding back into the none. And the moment that pattern faltered, even slightly, everyone would feel it. The Theban priests, who had spent generations polishing the idea that Amun was the invisible, self-created mind behind the Ogdoad, looked at Ra blazing across the sky and made an ingenious theological move. Instead of competing, they merged. Amun and Ra became Amun-Ra, a single supreme god who was simultaneously the hidden force of the universe and its visible, life-giving sun. It was a perfect marriage of opposites. Amun the concealed, Ra the revealed, Amun the silent, Ra the radiant. Worshippers could bow to the sun they saw and trust that the same power continued working unseen in the darkness. No contradiction, just layers. This fusion was not an act of conquest, but of addition, which is the trick that makes Egyptian syncretism so slippery to modern minds. The Thebans did not erase Ra to elevate Amun. They did not reduce Amun to a minor solar sidekick. They simply declared that the two had always been one, that the hidden creator and the blazing sun were the same being wearing different masks. Amun-Ra became the king of the gods, the universal creator, the ruler of both the visible and invisible realms. Every other deity could now be understood as a facet of his being, a local expression of a single, overwhelming truth. This theological habit, blending gods without killing them, was not a flaw in Egyptian religion. It was the engine. Local powers kept their identities, their temples, their festivals, but they also participated in a larger unity that made the entire country feel like a single divine conversation. And for the pharaoh, who was already both Horus and the son of Ra, the rise of Amun-Ra meant that the throne now rested on the broadest possible cosmic foundation. The king answered to a god who was everywhere, seen and unseen, hidden and blazing, a perfect reflection of royal power itself. But supreme kings also have tempers, and Ra's temper was a force of nature so volatile that it had to be separated from his body and given a personality of its own. The eye of Ra was not merely an organ of sight. It was a divine weapon, a feminine power that could be sent out into the world to act on the sun god's behalf, and sometimes against his will. It was simultaneously protective, destructive, and alarmingly independent. The kind of power you deploy only when you are ready to accept consequences you cannot fully control. The most famous physical form of this eye was the uraeus, the rearing cobra that adorned the crowns of pharaohs and gods alike. The Egyptians called her Wadjet, the green one, and she was not a decoration. She was the living flame coiled on the king's brow, spitting venom and fire at anyone foolish enough to threaten the throne. Every pharaoh who ever wore the double crown understood that he carried a goddess on his forehead, and that her patience was not infinite. But the eye had a deeper, stranger mythology. She was also a daughter, and her relationship with her father followed a pattern that would repeat across multiple goddesses. In various tellings, the eye was Hathor, or Sekhmet, or Tefnut, depending on which temple was telling the story, and which aspect of feminine power they wanted to emphasize. The pattern was always the same. The daughter became estranged, enraged, or simply homesick for some distant place, often the burning lands of Nubia to the south. She fled, taking the sun's heat and blessing with her. The world grew cold, the Nile faltered, and Ra, missing his fierce child, had to send someone clever to coax her back with music, stories, and the promise of drunken festivals. The distant goddess cycle, as it came to be called, was the mythic engine that explained why the world sometimes felt out of balance, and why the return of joy always followed a period of desolation. The eye was wrath, but she was also the possibility of reconciliation. And that possibility would soon be tested to its absolute limit when humanity itself decided to test the aging sun god's patience, forcing Ra to unleash his eye in a form so terrible that the entire species nearly ended in a single night of blood and beer. Before the wrath, there was the joy, and the name of that joy was Hathor. If the eye of Ra was the sun's burning anger, Hathor was the sun's golden smile, the warmth that made grapes swell on the vine and made humans forget their troubles long enough to dance. She was the goddess of love, beauty, music, and intoxication, often shown with the ears of a cow, not because the Egyptians thought cattle were especially romantic, but because cows were the gentle mothers who gave milk and life without asking questions. Her face was framed by heavy braids, her eyes lined with kohl, her expression eternally amused, as if she had already heard every prayer ever spoken and found most of them charmingly predictable. Hathor was the patroness of everything that made existence bearable. She invented music. She taught mortals how to get drunk, and more importantly, she taught them that drunkenness was a sacred state, a temporary loosening of the self that allowed the divine to slip in through the cracks. Her temples were filled with sistrum rattles, the percussive shake of metal on metal that mimicked the sound of papyrus reeds rustling in the wind, and with dancers who moved until the boundary between worship and ecstasy dissolved. She was the golden one, the lady of the sycamore, and that tree mattered. The sycamore fig was one of the few trees that thrived on the edge of the desert, and Hathor was said to dwell within it, offering water and fruit to the souls of the dead who wandered parched through the necropolis. A sip from her branch was a taste of rebirth. But the thing about Hathor, and this was the terrifying fine print, was that her gentle, nurturing nature was not her only nature. The same goddess who cradled the sun at dawn and nursed the infant Horus on her lap was also capable of becoming the raging eye of Ra, the destroyer who could flood a battlefield with blood and laugh while doing it. The Egyptians did not see this as a contradiction. They saw it as the truth of all-powerful love, that it can turn into annihilation the moment it is betrayed. Her dual identity was the promise that the distant goddess, once enraged, could be lured home again with music and wine, and the world could be remade through joy. And when the gentle face of love finally turned away, the face that replaced it was Sekhmet. She was not a goddess you worshipped for comfort. She was the power you prayed would pass over your house. Sekhmet had the head of a lioness and the heart of a desert storm, and she was the burning eye of Ra in its most literal sense, the heat that scorched the fields, the plague that traveled on the hot wind, the unrelenting wrath that did not negotiate and did not forgive. Her name means the powerful one, which is the kind of understatement that makes you wonder if the Egyptians had a sense of gallows humor. She was divine retribution given a physical form, the enforcer sent when words and warnings had failed. In temple art, she is often shown holding a flail or a curved blade, and her red garments echo the color of the blood-soaked battlefield she was said to leave behind. The Egyptians associated her with the scorching midday sun, the hour when the light is no longer nurturing but murderous, when laborers collapse and sensible creatures find shade. That was Sekhmet's hour. Her role as Ra's weapon against humanity's rebellion was not metaphor. It was history written in cosmic terms. When mankind conspired to overthrow the aging sun god, Ra did not send a polite envoy with a list of grievances. He unleashed his eye in the form of Sekhmet, and she descended on the earth with a joy that was terrifying precisely because it was not angry. She was not in a rage. She was in a state of ecstatic, single-minded purpose, slaughtering the rebels until the desert sand was slick with blood and the Nile ran red. The texts are explicit that she could not be stopped by any normal means. She was the divine force of destruction, and destruction was what she was doing, and no force on earth could tell her the task was complete. The only thing that could halt the annihilation was a trick involving beer, and the fate of the human species was about to depend on it. The tragedy, or perhaps the farce depending on how generous you are feeling, began with mankind making the worst strategic decision in its collective existence. Ra had grown old. His bones ached, his jaw drooped, and the humans he had created looked at their decrepit sun god and began to laugh. Worse, they began to plot. They gathered in the deserts and whispered of overthrowing him, of building a world without his glare. Ra, even in his dotage, heard the whispers. An aging king who has been laughed at is a dangerous thing. He summoned his eye, the divine flame that could take any shape it wished, and he sent it down in the form of Hathor, the golden one, the goddess of music and joy. But the moment her feet touched the blood-soaked sand, the gold peeled away, and Sekhmet emerged. The slaughter that followed was not warfare. It was pestilence with claws. Sekhmet waded into humanity and began to kill with a joy that the texts describe with horrified precision. She drank their blood. She scattered their bones. She laughed, and her laughter was the roar of a lioness who has discovered that prey is infinite. The sand turned red, the Nile ran thick, and Ra watched from the heavens, satisfied at first, then concerned, then increasingly horrified as he realized Sekhmet was not going to stop. She had acquired a taste for annihilation, and no force on earth or in heaven could command her to relent. Desperation breeds ingenuity. Ra ordered his servants to travel to the Isle of Elephantine, the island at the river's first cataract near modern Aswan, and gather vast quantities of red ochre. They brewed 7,000 jars of beer, mixed it with the ochre until it shimmered like a lake of blood, and poured it across the fields where Sekhmet would hunt at dawn. She awoke, saw the crimson flood, and drank. She drank until the fields were empty and her belly was full. The lioness lay down, belched, and when she rose again, it was Hathor who stood blinking in the morning light, her rage drowned in fermentation. This was the etiology, the mythic origin story of the great drunken festivals of Egypt, the yearly celebrations where beer flowed until the celebrants forgot their own names. The remnant of humanity was saved, but Ra was finished with them. He looked at the world he had made, the creatures who had mocked him, the daughter who had nearly ended them all, and he felt a weariness that no sunrise could cure. He decided to withdraw, to lift himself into the sky and leave the messy business of existence to others. The age of the sun walking among mortals was over, and so the sun withdrew, but withdrawing from the earth did not mean retiring. The night journey that followed was no peaceful cruise through a starry void. The moment Ra's day bark, the manjet, touched the western horizon, he transferred to the night bark, the mesectet, and began the most dangerous commute in the cosmos, the 12-hour voyage through the Jewet, the underworld that was neither fully death nor fully dream. The Jewet was a realm of gates, 12 of them, one for each hour of night, each guarded by monstrous serpents and demons whose names had to be known, whose passwords had to be spoken perfectly, because a single mispronounced syllable meant annihilation. Ra's bark sailed through caverns of fire and fields of ice, through rivers of boiling water and halls where the shadows had teeth. The dead who had been properly buried and equipped with the right spells waited on the banks for his passage. When they saw the glow of his bark approaching, they let out a great acclamation, a cry of joy, because the light of Ra meant they could breathe again. For one brief moment each night, the blessed dead were not corpses. They were a living audience, praising the sun as he passed. At the deepest hour, the bark reached the nadir, the point of maximum danger and maximum mystery. Here Ra's soul merged with the body of Osiris, the murdered king who had become lord of the underworld. It was a union of the solar and the chthonic, the living flame and the still, fertile darkness. One god was all movement and light. The other was all stillness and regeneration. Together, they recharged the battery of creation. From that union, Ra emerged reborn, his strength restored, his infant form ready to crack the eastern horizon. The bark continued its ascent. The gates swung open in reverse, and the serpent of chaos, whose name was Apophis, waited in the darkness ahead, already coiling for the attack that came every single night without exception. That serpent was Apophis, and the name alone deserves a moment of respect. Apophis, sometimes called Apep, was not a god you bargained with. He was not a necessary chaos, not a misunderstood trickster, not a force of disorder that could be balanced against order. He was the principle of uncreation itself, a serpent so vast that the Jewet could barely contain him. His coils wrapped around the narrow passage where Ra's bark had to pass. His goal was not conquest. It was annihilation. If he succeeded, the sun would never rise again. The Nun would swallow the world back into its inert black waters, and every god, every human, every memory would be erased, as though nothing had ever been. The battle happened every single night. As Ra's bark approached the 7th hour, the waters ahead churned, and Apophis rose from the darkness, his mouth wide enough to drink the entire river of stars. His roar was silence. His eyes were the void before creation. And standing at the prow of the bark, spear in hand, ready to fight, was almost always Seth. This is the part of the story that causes whiplash for anyone who only knows Seth as the murderer of Osiris, the usurper, the jealous brother. Yet here he was, the only god strong and ruthless enough to meet the serpent head-on. Seth Sudek, the red-haired lord of storms and foreign deserts, would drive his spear into Apophis's mouth, pinning him, while Isis and other deities chanted spells to hold the beast at bay. The serpent writhed, bled, and retreated, but he never died. He healed. He waited. He would be back tomorrow night with the same rage and the same impossible hunger. This cosmic fight had a mirror on Earth. In temples across Egypt, priests performed nightly execration rites, drawing images of Apophis on papyrus, or modeling him in wax, then stabbing, burning, spitting, and trampling the effigy while reciting the same spells used in the duet. What happened in the heavens was not distant myth. It was real-time warfare, and every human ritual was a reinforcement. A small but necessary spear thrust aimed at the throat of annihilation. The universe was not secure. It was constantly defended, and the defenders were gods who themselves were flawed, violent, and indispensable. But if Seth was the chaos that defended against chaos, his brother Osiris was the reason civilization existed in the first place, and the reason the dead had any hope at all. Osiris, whose Egyptian name was Wesir, was not born a god of the underworld. He was born a king, the eldest child of Jeb and Nut. He inherited the throne of Egypt and ruled as the Golden Age made flesh, teaching humanity to plant grain, to abandon cannibalism, to write laws, to worship properly. He was the bringer of agriculture and order, the gentle king who turned a scrambling species into a civilization. And every description of his reign reads like someone remembering a dream of peace that is already fading. His brother Seth hated him. The jealousy was not subtle. It was a hot, bright, unambiguous thing, the way the desert hates the fertile soil. At a banquet, Seth produced a beautiful chest, a sarcophagus really, and offered it as a gift to whoever fit inside. When Osiris lay down within it, Seth slammed the lid and sealed it with molten lead. The chest became a coffin, the banquet became a murder scene, and the good king's body was thrown into the Nile, which carried it away like a piece of driftwood. The Golden Age ended with a snapped lock and a splash. What followed was the first resurrection in Egyptian myth, and it set the pattern for everything that would come after. Osiris's sister wife, Isis, whose name was Aset, searched the world for his body, found it, and used her mastery of Heka. The Egyptians used this word for magic, though it meant something closer to authoritative speech, the power to command reality through words, to piece him back together. and breathe enough life into him to conceive their son, Horus. Osiris did not return to the land of the living. He became something else. He descended into the duat and took his throne as the Lord of the dead, the judge of every soul, the green-skinned king whose body was wrapped like a mummy, and whose skin was the color of new vegetation pushing through black soil. He was the wheat that was cut down and buried, the Nile that receded and returned, the promise that death was not an ending, but a transformation. Every Egyptian who died hoped to become an Osiris, to have their name spoken and their body preserved, so that they too might be resurrected in his image and live forever in the fields he ruled. And the reason any of that was possible, the one who pulled Osiris back from the oblivion Seth intended, was his sister wife Isis, whose Egyptian name was Aset, and whose reputation for cunning was so formidable it made her the most dangerous deity in the pantheon, not despite her femininity, but because she had weaponized it so completely. She was the devoted wife, yes, but devotion in her hands was not passive adoration. It was a relentless, methodical, and occasionally terrifying force of nature. She was the throne goddess, often depicted wearing a throne-shaped headdress that was literally her name written in hieroglyphs, because Isis did not just sit on power. She was power, the seat of legitimacy itself, the reason any king could claim to rule. Her mastery of Heka, that authoritative speech that commanded reality, surpassed every other god. She did not simply know spells. She knew the secret names of things, the hidden words that made the universe tremble and obey. When she found the body of Osiris, she did not weep and give up. She transformed herself and her sister into kites, birds of prey, and beat her wings to fan the breath back into his lungs. And she spoke the words that stitched his soul to his corpse long enough to conceive their child. She was a widow, a fugitive, and a mother, all in the same breath. And she managed each role with a strategic brilliance that would make a war general weep with envy. She hid the infant Horus in the papyrus marshes of the Delta, the region where the Nile fans out into the Mediterranean near modern Alexandria, raising him in secret while Seth's spies hunted them. She was the mother of the rightful king, and she knew that every moment of her son's survival was a direct threat to the usurper. So she wove protections, healed scorpion stings, and taught Horus that legitimacy was not given. It was built, defended, and eventually fought for in a courtroom that would take 80 years to reach a verdict. And when Isis finally found the body, she was not alone. Her sister Nephthys, who had married Set, but whose heart had clearly chosen the other side of the family, stood beside her in the marshes. Together, they transformed. Their arms became wings, their hair became feathers, their cries became the high, keening wail of kites, the sharp-winged birds of prey that circle over carrion in the desert, and they descended upon the corpse of Osiris. The mourning of Isis and Nephthys was not an outburst of private grief. It was a ritual that rewired the universe. The two goddesses threw themselves across the body and screamed, and the scream was not just sorrow. It was Heka, authoritative speech, the same force Isis had used to stitch Osiris back together long enough to conceive Horus. Every syllable of their lament was a surgical tool. One cry called the soul back from the darkness. Another cry commanded the breath to rise again in the throat. A third cry reminded the heart that it had beaten once and could beat again. The Egyptians called these lamentations the songs of the two kites, and they were not optional poetry. They were the audible mechanism of resurrection. In temples and tombs across Egypt, priestesses reenacted this moment daily. Two women, often chosen for the purity of their voices, would stand at the foot of every funerary bier, raise their arms like wings, and wail the same words Isis and Nephthys had wailed at the dawn of death. Their voices were not mere performances. They were sonic keys meant to unlock the door between the living and the dead. The sound itself was the magic. The words, carried on the breath, restored what silence had stolen. This is why Egyptian funerals were never quiet affairs. Silence was a symptom of the second death. Noise, the right noise, was a weapon Seth could not defeat, and the two sisters had perfected it into the most devastating sound in the world. And the god they were screaming against, the architect of the murder, the usurper on the throne, was Set. His Egyptian name was Sudek, and if the story stopped at the murder of Osiris, he would be easy to dismiss as a simple villain, a jealous brother who sawed through the family tree and laughed as it fell. But the Egyptians were not in the business of simple villains. Set was the god of chaos, yes, but chaos was not the same as evil. Chaos was the storm that broke the dam, the hot desert wind that dried the river, the foreign army massing on the border. It was terrifying, destructive, and absolutely necessary, because a world without chaos was a world that had forgotten how to fight. Set was the red god, the lord of the red land, the desert that began where the black soil of the Nile stopped. His skin was the color of the sand at midday. His head was that of a creature no one has ever identified, a long snout and square-tipped ears that belonged to no known animal, as if the Egyptians wanted to emphasize that he was foreign even to the animal kingdom. He was the god of thunder and earthquakes, of places where no crop grew and no law held. The rage that drove him to murder Osiris was not subtle. He coveted the throne, despised the order his brother represented, and when the beautiful chest was offered at that banquet, he saw his moment and took it with the precision of a predator. But then the story bends, because the same Set who drowned his brother in the Nile was the only god strong enough, vicious enough, and unafraid enough to stand at the prow of Ra's night bark and drive a spear into the throat of Apophis. The serpent of uncreation recoiled from Set in a way it recoiled from no other deity. The god of disorder was the universe's best defense against total annihilation, because sometimes you need a monster to fight a monster. Set was not pure evil. He was the principle that struggle was not a flaw in creation, but the engine that kept it spinning. His eventual clash with Horus, the rightful heir, was not a battle between good and evil. It was the cosmic argument between the rules as written and the rules as bent, between the throne inherited and the throne seized, and the resolution of that argument would define the meaning of kingship itself. While Set was busy roaring his chaos across the desert and driving a spear through the throat of uncreation, the woman who had married him was standing on the opposite side of every moral line he had ever drawn. Nephthys, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar, the lady of the mansion, was the sister of Isis and the consort of Set, a pairing that must have made family dinners an exercise in endurance. But her loyalty was never a simple matter of marital obligation. It was a quiet, unshakable allegiance to the side of life, to the memory of Osiris, to the sister who had mastered magic and needed an accomplice. She was the shadow companion, the one who moved in the background while Isis commanded the stage. While Isis spoke the Heka that rewired death, Nephthys stood at her shoulder, her own arms raised in the kite form, her own voice joining the lamentation that restored the soul. Her name, Nebuchadnezzar, meant lady of the house, but the house she protected was not the domestic home of a happy marriage. It was the funerary chapel, the tomb, the threshold between the living and the dead. She was the goddess of liminality, that unsettling space where boundaries blur, where night gives way to dawn, and the soul hovers between judgment and paradise. Her association with night was not sinister. It was protective. Darkness can be a threat, but it can also be a blanket. Nephthys wrapped the dead in her wings, shielded the vulnerable in the hour when Seth's storms howled, and kept watch over the household shrines while the world slept. There is a persistent and tantalizing thread in the mythology that hints she may have been the mother of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, not by Set, but by Osiris, in a moment of confusing, moonlit union. Whether this was scandal or sacred truth depended on which temple was telling the story, but it added another layer to her mystery. She was the sister who betrayed her husband, the wife who had no children with the god of chaos, the mourner whose tears were invisible but essential. Without Nephthys, the lamentations would have been half as loud, and half as loud would not have been enough to wake the dead. The child whose life they had so carefully guarded, the infant hidden in the rushes, while his mother wove spells and his aunt kept watch, was Horus the younger, also called Harpocrates by the Greeks who later encountered him as a symbol of sacred silence. He was the posthumous son of Osiris, conceived in that impossible moment between death and magic, and the fact of his birth was itself a political statement that Set could not ignore. Every breath the boy took was a challenge. Isis raised him in the papyrus thickets of the delta, the marshlands where the river dissolves into a labyrinth of reeds and shallow water. It was a nursery of hiding places where snakes and scorpions were a daily threat. But Isis was not a mother who prayed for safety. She was a mother who wrapped the child in layers of Heka so dense that venom itself could not touch him. The young Horus learned to hunt, to fish, to fight, and above all, to remember that his father's throne was occupied by the god who had murdered him. This was not a childhood. It was a training montage scripted by grief and ambition. He grew into a warrior, but not a brute. Horus, the younger, embodied the ideal of divine kingship precisely because he had to earn it. He had not inherited a peaceful kingdom. He was the avenger, the son who owed his father a debt that could only be paid in cosmic court. His very existence was the argument that legitimacy mattered, that the throne was not a prize for the strongest, but a sacred trust passed from a father to a deserving heir. The pharaohs of Egypt would invoke his name for 3,000 years, because every single one of them, in their coronation rituals, became Horus on the throne. They were the living avengers, the sons who maintained the mortuary cult of their fathers, the proof that order eventually could outlast chaos. The coming conflict between Horus and Set would take 80 years of legal wrangling, physical combat, and acts of low cunning that would make any earthly courtroom blush. The conflict that followed was not a battle. It was an 80-year courtroom drama with intermittent violence, and every single participant behaved badly. The contendings of Horus and Set, preserved in a papyrus that reads less like scripture and more like a divine gossip column, details the legal war between the falcon-headed avenger and the red-haired usurper before the tribunal of the Ennead. The question was simple. Who should rule? The answer was not. The gods convened under the authority of Ra, who, as the aging sun, preferred things as they were. Set was his defender on the solar bark. Horus was an untested youth with a clever mother. Ra openly favored Set. The other gods, including Shu and the rest of the Ennead, leaned toward Horus, not out of principle, but because Isis had spent decades making sure they would. The trial ground to a stalemate almost instantly, and it would grind on for 80 years because neither side could afford to lose. Isis turned the first trick. She transformed herself into a beautiful young widow and sat weeping outside Set's palace. When he approached, charmed, she told him a story. A stranger had killed her husband and seized his cattle, casting her son into the wilderness. Set, ever the populist, exploded with righteous fury. He demanded the stranger be beaten and the son restored to his inheritance. Isis revealed herself as a kite and laughed at him. Set had condemned himself with his own mouth, and the tribunal took note. But Set was not defeated. He was merely humiliated, and humiliated gods with power do not concede. He challenged Horus to a test of physical transformation. Both were to become hippopotamuses and submerge in the river. The first to surface after 3 months would lose. They plunged into the Nile. Isis, watching from the bank, panicked. She hurled a harpoon and struck Horus by mistake, then threw again and hit Set. He surfaced, screaming, his voice a wounded bellow. Begging her as her brother, he appealed to their mother's womb, and her heart softened. She freed him. Horus erupted from the water in a rage, severed his mother's head with a single blow, and carried it into the desert. The tribunal had to pause while Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom who had been quietly recording the whole disaster, replaced her head with that of a cow. This was considered a reasonable solution. There was the episode of the lettuce. Set, in a gesture of apparent reconciliation, invited Horus to his bed. During the night, he attempted to assert dominance over the younger god in the most intimate way. Horus, warned by his mother, caught the seed in his hand and brought it to Isis, who screamed and flung it into the marshes. Then she took her son's seed and sprinkled it on the lettuce in Set's garden. Set ate it and went before the tribunal boasting of his conquest. Thoth asked both sides to call their seed forth. Set's answered from the swamp. Horus's answered from Set's own body. The court dissolved into chaos, and Set's humiliation was so complete that he fled. The stone-boat race was no cleaner. Set challenged Horus to build boats of stone. Horus, understanding that his opponent was not clever but merely loud, built a boat of pine and plastered it with gypsum until it glistened like granite. Set, in earnest, carved a mountain peak into a hull. His boat sank. He turned into a hippopotamus and rammed Horus's vessel. Horus harpooned him, and the tribunal had to physically separate them. Through it all, Thoth recorded. Isis schemed. Ra grumbled. Osiris wrote letters from the underworld, pointing out that the dead have no offerings without Horus on the throne, and a god without offerings is a hungry ghost. That threat tipped the scales. The verdict, when it finally came, had the air of a foregone conclusion that had simply taken 80 years to state aloud. The tribunal of the Ennead, exhausted and embarrassed by the lettuce and the severed head and the sunken stone boat, proclaimed Horus the true king of Egypt. Or more accurately, they stopped not proclaiming it. Ra withdrew his objection, the scales tipped, and the falcon took his father's throne. But the decider was not really the Ennead. It was Osiris himself, writing from the underworld with the cold logic of the dead. He asked a simple question. Who, if Horus does not rule, will provide the offerings that feed every soul in the duet? The gods understood the economics of eternity. Horus was vindicated. Set's fate was not annihilation. The Egyptians did not believe in destroying necessary chaos, only in putting it in its proper place. In some versions, Set was dragged before Ra and bound in chains. A prisoner of the solar bark he had once defended. In other versions, he was reconciled, given the deserts and the storms and the roaring edge of the world as his domain, a throne that could never be comfortable and would never be stable. Sometimes he was both. The myth allowed for all interpretations, because the question of what to do with necessary disorder is not a question that has a single answer. This divine verdict was the mythic precedent for every royal succession that would ever happen in Egypt. The dead king became Osiris. the living air became Horus, and the struggle against chaos was not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. Every coronation was a replay of this verdict. Every pharaoh who sat on the throne was Horus vindicated, the son who had fought for his father's memory and won. The contendings were not a scandal. They were the Constitution, written in divine blood and courtroom absurdity, and their conclusion meant that Mad, that cosmic principle of truth and balance, had been restored. The restoration of Mad required a record, and the God who kept that record, who had silently transcribed every humiliation and legal maneuver of the 80-year tribunal without ever losing his place, was Thoth. His Egyptian name was Jehudi, and if the pantheon had a brain, he was it. He appears in two forms, sometimes with the head of an ibis, the long-beaked marsh bird whose curved bill resembles a crescent moon, and sometimes with the head of a baboon, the dog-faced primate that greets the dawn with frantic barking. Both forms were chosen for their association with the moon, that pale scribe of the night sky whose phases became the first calendar. Thoth invented writing, not metaphorically, not as a divine gift handed down fully formed, but as a systematic act of genius. He gave humanity hieroglyphs, which the Egyptians called Medunetcher, the words of the gods, and in doing so, he gave them the ability to make their thoughts permanent. Every temple library, every scroll of spells, every tax record scratched onto a potsherd existed because Thoth had decided that wisdom should outlive the brain that produced it. He was the divine secretary, the scribe who recorded the names of the dead and the verdicts of the judges, and his impartiality was absolute. He did not care who won the throne. He cared that the record was accurate. During the contendings, he was the calm at the center of the storm. He recorded Set's self-condemnation, called forth the seed from the swamp and from Set's own body, and replaced Isis's severed head with that of a cow without a trace of panic. He was the arbiter who calmed the strife between Horus and Set not through force, but through precision, the God who understood that justice is often a matter of getting the details right. His role would only grow more consequential in the next great threshold every soul must cross, the weighing of the heart, where his ibis head would lean over the scale, and his stylus would hover above the papyrus, ready to write down the only result that mattered. The verdict Horus had won and Thoth had recorded was not a personal victory. It was the restoration of Mad. This word, small and weightless on the tongue, was the most important concept in the Egyptian universe. Mad was at once a winged goddess with an ostrich feather in her hair, and an abstract cosmic principle that made the sun rise, the seasons turn, and the dead speak truth in the hall of judgment. She was the truth that held the stars in their courses, the balance that kept the Nile from swallowing the land, the order that separated a kingdom from a massacre. Her opposite was Isfet, the chaos that Seth had unleashed when he hacked his brother into pieces and seized the throne. Isfit was not a god with a temple. It was the lie, the famine, the unreasoning violence, the serpent Apophis, the collapse of everything into the none. The pharaoh's primary duty, more pressing than building monuments or winning wars, was to uphold Mad against Isfit. Every offering he made, every temple he raised, every rebel he crushed was an act of cosmic maintenance. A king who failed to uphold Mad was not a bad king. He was an ontological crisis, a crack in the floor of reality. The symbol of Mad was a single ostrich feather, long and white and impossibly light. And this feather was the standard against which every human heart would be weighed after death. Not the pharaoh's heart alone, but every heart. Mad was not an aristocratic virtue. She was the demand that a peasant's word was as binding as a vizier's, that the scales did not care who you had been. The feather was trueness, and trueness was not measured in great deeds, but in the absence of lies. To live in Mad was to speak the truth, to give fair measure in the market, to honor your parents, to feed the hungry. To die in Mad was to approach the scale with a heart light as a breath. To die without her was to face the devourer, the thing that waited beneath the pan with its mouth already open. The soul arrived there alone, though not entirely unaccompanied, because Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the necropolis, who had been the first embalmer of the dead, was waiting. He was not there to comfort. He was there to escort, to guide the deceased by the hand into the Hall of Two Truths, a vast chamber whose pillars were shadow, and whose floor reflected the stars that no longer existed. At the center of that hall stood a scale, and on that scale, the entire meaning of a life would be weighed. The scale was not a metaphor. It was a real instrument in the hands of Anubis, who knelt before it with the concentration of a surgeon, adjusting the chain, checking the balance. On one pan, he placed a single ostrich feather, the symbol of Mad, that cosmic truth and order whose restoration had been the entire point of Horus winning his throne. This feather was so light that a breath could have sent it drifting across the floor. But it was also the heaviest thing in the universe, because it represented perfect truth, and perfect truth has a weight that no lie can match. On the other pan, Anubis placed the heart of the deceased. The Egyptians understood the heart, the Ib, not as a pump, but as the seat of intelligence, memory, and moral record. Every lie, every cruelty, every unpaid debt, every secret pleasure taken at another's expense had inscribed itself into the tissue of that organ. The heart remembered what the mouth had forgotten. And standing beside the scale, his ibis head tilted with clinical detachment, Thoth waited with a stylus and a palette, ready to record the result. He had already written down the entire trial. This was simply the final number. If the heart was as light as the feather, the deceased was declared Makeru, true of voice, justified. The heart and the feather would balance perfectly, and Anubis would step aside to allow the soul to proceed into the presence of Osiris, into the blessed fields where grain grew taller than a man. But if the heart was heavy, if it sank on the scale because it was caked with the residue of a dishonest life, then something else waited. Something whose name was spoken only in whispers, even among the gods. The guide who had led the deceased to that very moment of judgment. The silent figure with the jackal's head, who adjusted the scale with the precision of a surgeon, was Anubis. His Egyptian name was Anpu, and if Osiris was the king of the dead, Anubis was the one who did the actual work. He was the god of mummification, the lord of the necropolis, the guardian of every tomb entrance in the Valley of the Kings. His job was not to judge, but to prepare, to protect, and to escort. And he had been doing it since before Osiris took his first breath. The jackal form was not chosen for its elegance. Jackals were scavengers, yellow-eyed prowlers of the desert edge, digging at shallow graves and dragging bones into the moonlight. The Egyptians, with their genius for turning a threat into a guardian, took the animal that menaced their dead and made it the protector of their dead. Anubis is always shown as a sleek black jackal, black not because that was the natural color, but because black was the color of the fertile Nile silt, the color of regeneration. It was the color a corpse turned when it had been properly embalmed and wrapped, and that transformation was entirely his domain. He was the first embalmer. When Osiris lay in pieces, his body a scattered puzzle set had thrown across the kingdom, it was Anubis who gathered the fragments and performed the first mummification in history. He washed the flesh, applied the sacred oils, wrapped the limbs in linen, and spoke the spells that bound the soul to the body for eternity. Isis and Nephthys wailed their lamentations. Horus stood guard, but Anubis worked. He was the inventor of the ritual that every corpse in Egypt would undergo for 3,000 years. The original mortician, whose techniques the priests would imitate in every embalming tent along the Nile. The dead entered his workshop as frightened souls and emerged as Osiris himself, green-skinned and smiling, ready for the Hall of Two Truths. And when they arrived there, he was already waiting, crouched beside the scale, his jackal eyes fixed on the trembling heart, because his duty was not finished until the weighing was complete and the record was sealed. That first mummification, the original act that every embalmer in Egypt would imitate for the next 3,000 years, happened in a borrowed workshop at the edge of the world. Anubis, the jackal-headed god who had been the first to handle the dead with reverence rather than fear, stood over the body of Osiris and prepared to do what no god had ever done. He was not going to bury a corpse. He was going to build a new body, a perfect body, a body that could house a soul for eternity. The body of Osiris was a ruin. Seth had hacked it into 14 pieces, scattered from the delta to the cataracts. Isis had gathered them. Nephthys had wept over them. But gathering is not healing, and weeping is not restoration. Anubis took command. He brought the pieces together on a slab of alabaster and began the slow, meticulous work of binding them into a single form. He washed the flesh with water drawn from the Nile at dawn. He anointed it with oils of cedar and myrrh that had been blessed by Ra himself. He packed the cavities with natron, the sacred salt that drank moisture from the air and could drink decay from a wound. And he wrapped every limb in strips of the finest linen, each layer accompanied by a spell, each spell a command that this body would not rot, would not stiffen, would not surrender to the darkness that had claimed it. Isis and Nephthys did not merely watch. They were the kite women, the sister wife of the dead king and her shadow companion, and their role was to speak the words that completed what the wrappings began. Horus, the falcon-headed avenger who had not yet fought his war, stood guard with his spear, because the desert was full of things that hungered for the scent of resurrection. Together, the four of them performed the first funerary rite, the template for every mummy that would ever be laid to rest in a painted tomb. The goal was not to preserve a dead man. It was to transform him. The wrapped and anointed figure on that alabaster slab was no longer a corpse. He was an Osiris. Every Egyptian who died hoped for exactly this transfiguration, to have their body become the body of the god, their name become his name, their resurrection become his resurrection, assured by the same rites and the same magic that Anubis had used on the first morning of death. But before Anubis ever placed the heart on the scale, long before the feather could tip one way or the other, the deceased had to pass a far more exhausting test. The Hall of Two Truths was not empty. Waiting in the shadows, arrayed along the walls in 2 rows of silent judgment, were 42 assessor gods, one for each nome, each administrative district of Egypt, but also one for each type of sin the human heart could incubate. They were not there to speak. They were there to listen. The deceased stepped forward and addressed each of them by name. This alone was a feat of memorization that required years of study, or a very good scribe to copy the spells onto a papyrus buried with the body. The text that guided the dead through this ordeal is preserved in spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, and it remains one of the most extraordinary ethical documents ever written. The deceased recited the negative confession, a litany of innocence that sounds less like a boast and more like a desperate man trying to remember every bad thing he had ever been accused of, and swearing before the gods that none of it was true. He declared that he had not stolen, not killed, not lied, not caused pain, not committed adultery, not stolen offerings from the temples, not diverted water from his neighbor's field, not made anyone weep, not been deaf to words of truth. On and on the list went, each denial addressed to a specific assessor god, whose name the deceased had to pronounce perfectly. The confessions were not general principles. They were granular, specific, designed to cover every possible moral failure a person living in a small agricultural community could commit. To slander a servant, to cheat on a measure of grain, to speak with unnecessary anger, to be impatient, to be loud. The Egyptians had an unnervingly clear-eyed view of what it meant to be a decent human being. This was the moment when ritual magic met moral reality. No amount of expensive linen or gilded masks could substitute for a lifetime lived in accordance with Mad. The spells were powerful, but they were not a cheat code. If the heart was heavy with the residue of actual sins, the words would ring hollow in the hall. The assessors would not be fooled. Thoth would simply note the failure, and Anubis would proceed with the weighing regardless. The negative confession was the ancient world's most terrifying job interview, and the candidate was already dead. But the negative confession, for all its exhausting detail, was only the testimony. The evidence was the heart itself, and when the heart failed the test, the punishment was not torture. It was cessation. Waiting at the base of the scale, crouched low to the ground, with her belly pressed against the floor of the Hall of Two Truths, was a creature whose name meant devourer, Ammit. She was not a goddess. She was a machine of annihilation built from the three most terrifying animals the Egyptians knew. Her head was that of a crocodile, the Nile's ambush predator, with jaws long enough to snap a man in half. Her foreparts were those of a lioness, the muscle and claw that belonged to Sekhmet's own form, the tools of an apex hunter. Her hindquarters were those of a hippopotamus, the most dangerous animal in Egypt despite its almost apologetic belly, a beast that could capsize boats and crush skulls in a single bite. She was a composite nightmare, and she did not speak. She only waited. When the heart tipped the scale, when the feather of Mad rose and the organs sank like a stone, Anubis did not hesitate. He took the heart and flung it to the floor, and Ammit opened her triple jaws and ate. The sound of that consumption was the last thing the failed soul would ever perceive. What Ammit devoured was not merely an organ, but the seat of a person's entire identity, their memories, their loves, their debts and secrets, and smallest kindnesses. With the heart gone, the deceased could not think, could not remember, could not exist. This was the second death, the complete annihilation of the soul. There was no eternal punishment in the Egyptian afterlife. No lake of fire, no demon with a pitchfork, no repetitive torment designed to last for millions of years. There was simply the end. The unworthy were not condemned to suffer. They were condemned to vanish, to become less than a ghost, less than a shadow, never having existed in the eyes of the gods or the memory of the living. For a civilization that built its entire religion on the desperate hope of immortality, Ammit was the darkest possible threat. The honest, terrifying acknowledgement that not everyone deserved to wake up after dying. But for those whose hearts balanced the feather, whose confessions had not rung hollow in that echoing hall of 42 assessor gods, the door that opened did not lead to Ammit's jaws. It led to Aru. The Greeks called it the Elysian Fields when they later tried to cram their own afterlife into Egyptian geography. But Aru was not a Greek idea. It was pure Egyptian, the blessed fields, the realm of Osiris, and it was Egypt perfected. Imagine the delta, the fan of rich black soil where the Nile fragments into 100 channels before kissing the Mediterranean. The wheat there grows taller than a man. The barley bends heavy with golden grain. The canals are full, but not flooding. The breeze is constant, but never hot. The dead who arrive in Aru do not float as disembodied spirits. They have bodies. Their bodies can taste, can touch, can embrace the loved ones who arrived before them. They wear the same white linen they wore in life, but now it never stains and never tears. And they work. This is the part that tends to surprise modern sensibilities, because paradise is supposed to be a vacation. But the Egyptians did not dream of eternal leisure. They dreamed of eternal meaningful labor. The justified dead plow fields, harvest crops, and sail boats along the canals. And they do it with a lightness of heart that makes toil feel like music. For those who had been wealthy enough to afford them, small figurines called shaptis, little servant statues of clay or faience, were placed in the tomb. These shaptis were inscribed with spells commanding them to answer when the deceased's name was called to do any work in the afterlife. The shapti would spring to life and say, "Here I am," and take the hoe or the basket, leaving the deceased free to enjoy the shade. The Egyptians had invented automation in the afterlife millennia before anyone dreamed of a machine. This was the eternal paradise, a perfected Egypt where the Nile always rose just enough, where the sycamore figs were always ripe, where Osiris himself could be seen walking between the barley rows, his green face smiling. It was peace, not the peace of stillness, but the peace of a world operating exactly as it should, with Mad restored and Isfet a distant memory. The dangers of the Jewat, Apophis, the demons at the gates, the scale and the devourer were behind them. The blessed had earned their place in the sunlight forever. The sunlight of Aru, that eternal warmth on the faces of the justified dead, came not from some abstract force, but from a goddess who had been there since the earliest days, arched silently above every field and every tomb, holding the stars on her body like jewels sewn into a gown of lapis lazuli. Nut, the sky goddess, had not stopped protecting the dead simply because she had been pried apart from her lover Jeb by their father Shu. That eternal pillar of air, whose uplifted arms still pushed her away from the earth's surface in a separation that defined the shape of the world. She was the great celestial vault, and her body was the sky itself. The Egyptians pictured her as an enormous woman whose limbs were infinite, her fingers touching the western horizon and her toes the eastern, her torso curving over the earth like a canopy of breathing blue. At night, her skin turned black and the stars emerged, not as distant balls of gas, but as the glittering light of the imperishable ones, the blessed dead who had climbed up her body to take their places among the constellations. She was a ladder and a shield, a mother whose embrace was the entire atmosphere. Her daily cycle was one of the most intimate and strange visions the Egyptians ever painted on a tomb ceiling. Every evening, Nut opened her mouth and swallowed the sun. Ra, in his red disk form, descended into her throat and traveled through her body during the dark hours, the way a child returns to the womb before birth. Every morning, she gave birth to him again, the sun emerging red and wet between her thighs, the first light of dawn, a cry of arrival. She was the swallower and the mother, the tomb and the cradle, the reason the sun could die every night and still return. The myth that would come next was about birth too, but it was the birth of her own children, and it required a cosmic heist against the calendar itself. That cosmic heist was committed by Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, who had been quietly recording the universe's most embarrassing divine trial, and who would one day weigh the souls of the dead. Before any of that courtroom drama, before Horus was even a gleam in Isis's magical eye, Thoth was already gambling with time itself. And the reason he gambled was that Nut, the sky goddess who arched her starry body over the earth, was pregnant with the 5 children who would become the core actors of the entire mythic cycle. Ra, the sun god, that aging king who had already grown weary of humanity's rebellion, had issued a decree. Nut would not give birth on any day of the year. Not one. The calendar itself was barred against her. The year then consisted of 360 days, neatly divided, no gaps. Nut was trapped in an endless pregnancy, her belly full of gods who could not be born, because no day existed that Ra had not already claimed. So Thoth played a game. He approached Khonsu, the moon god, the wanderer of the night sky, whose light waxed and waned with the months, and proposed a wager. The game was Senate, a board game of strategy, but the stakes were not chips or gold. The stakes were moonlight. Thoth won, and he won again, and he kept winning until he had gathered enough light to create 5 additional days, days that had never existed before, days that belonged to no month and no year. These were the epigonal days, the 5 days outside of time, wedged between the end of the old year and the start of the new. On the first, Nut gave birth to Osiris. On the second, Horus the elder. On the third, Set. On the fourth, Isis. On the fifth, Nephthys. One by one, her children slipped into existence on stolen moonlight, each birth a quiet act of rebellion against Ra's authority, each child destined to reshape the cosmos. The epigonal days remained forever sacred and forever strange, belonging to no month, a crack in the calendar through which divine chaos had entered the world. And the moon, having lost its extra light, would forever wax and wane, never again whole for an entire month, because Thoth had bartered a piece of it away for the sake of 5 children who would bring both murder and resurrection, chaos and kingship, into the world of gods and men. The moon god who had lost that wager, the divine bank from which Thoth had withdrawn 5 days' worth of light, was named Khonsu. He was not a minor figure relegated to the footnotes later myth. He was the youthful moon god of Thebes, a member of the sacred triad of that city, alongside his parents Amun and Mut, and his name meant the traveler, which was exactly what he was. Every night, he wandered the sky in his lunar bark, a young man with the sidelock of youth, the braided strand of hair that Egyptian children wore before they came of age. Khonsu's association with the Senate game against Thoth was not a minor detail. Senate was not merely a board game. It was a simulation of the journey through the Jewett, a contest of strategy that mirrored the soul's passage through the underworld's gates. To gamble at Senate was to gamble with fate itself. And Thoth, who had invented writing and understood every rule before they were spoken, had played Khonsu for pieces of his light as casually as someone might bet coins on a dice throw. The moon diminished, and the 5 days were born, and Khonsu was left forever diminished, waxing and waning in a monthly cycle that never quite added up to fullness. But he was more than a gambling victim. Khonsu was a healer. His name appears on stelae and amulets meant to drive out sickness, to soothe fevers, to protect children from the demons that lurked at the edges of the night. He was the light in the darkness, the cool silver that balanced the sun's hot gold, and his phases became the calendar's heartbeat. Time itself was measured by his losses and recoveries, the moon shrinking to a sliver, and then fattening again, a rhythm of diminishment and renewal that matched the Nile, the crops, and the pulse of every living heart. Magic and time were wound together in his phases, and every spell cast by moonlight was cast under his wandering eye. But while the moon waxed and waned according to Khonsu's diminished light, the city of Memphis, just south of modern Cairo, had never stopped worshipping the god who had made the moon and the sun and the ibis-headed gambler possible in the first place. Ptah, the craftsman who had thought the world into being, was not merely a creator among creators. He was the patron of every human being who had ever shaped raw material into something beautiful, useful, or terrifying. His temple in Memphis was not simply a shrine. It was a workshop, a design studio, a center of industry where the divine architect's methods were imitated by mortal hands. Ptah was the god of metalworkers, their furnaces his sacred fire, their copper chisels his holy instruments. He was the god of builders, every plumb line and level an echo of the precision with which he had spoken the first hill from the waters. He was the god of artisans, the men and women who carved statues, painted tomb walls, and hammered gold into funerary masks that would outlast empires. The act of making was not separate from the divine. It was the divine made visible. His living herald was the Apis bull, a single black bull kept in the temple complex at Memphis, marked with a white triangle on its forehead and a scarab-shaped mark on its tongue. This bull was not merely a symbol. He was the Ba, the manifestation of Ptah on earth. When the Apis bull walked through the temple courts, the god himself was walking. When the bull died, he was mummified with the same elaborate rites as a pharaoh, interred in a vast underground gallery called the Serapeum, and the priests began the search for his successor, a calf bearing the same sacred marks. The Apis was the living proof that Ptah's creative power was not confined to the moment of cosmic origin, but continued to pulse through the world, a maker who never stopped making, a craftsman who respected every honest trade, a god whose very existence argued that a well-carved chair was as sacred as a prayer properly spoken. And while we are in Memphis, having just spoken of Ptah's bull and his artisans, it is worth noting that the great craftsman did not sit alone in his temple. For a workshop cannot be a home, and Ptah, like every craftsman who ever burned the midnight oil, had a family. His consort was Sekhmet, the lioness-headed war deity who had once nearly erased humanity from the face of the earth before the red beer had tricked her into passing out. Their pairing was not exactly domestic bliss in the conventional sense. It was the union of the mind that designs and the fire that defends, the blueprint and the bodyguard. And the son of Ptah and Sekhmet was a god named Nefertum, who proves that the offspring of intense creativity and unrelenting rage can sometimes turn out to be a perfume salesman. Nefertum was the god of the primeval lotus, the blue water lily that had risen from the nun at the dawn of creation, that same lotus whose petals had opened to reveal the newborn sun. He was the fragrance of that moment, the first sweet scent that ever drifted across the primordial waters. He was the patron of perfume, of healing ointments, of the oils that anointed the bodies of pharaohs and corpses alike. He is often shown as a beautiful young man with a lotus blossom balanced on his head, sometimes with two plumes framing it, his expression one of serene, almost oblivious calm, as though he had inherited his father's intellect and his mother's intensity, but decided to channel both into something that smelled nice. This triad, Ptah the creator, Sekhmet the destroyer and defender, and Nefertum the reborn beauty of the lotus, expressed a complete cycle. Ptah conceived and spoke. Sekhmet protected, and when necessary, annihilated. Nefertum rose from the aftermath, fragrant and whole, the promise that after every destruction there is a new bloom. Memphis had built a holy family that did not merely sit in a shrine. They were the intellectual property of existence itself, creation, protection, and regeneration. Or, to put it less reverently, the architect, the bouncer, and the lovely smell that lets you know the party is still going. Not every god in Egypt smelled of lotus blossoms, and Sobek, the crocodile lord of the Fayum, would have eaten Nefertum's petals for a light snack if given the chance. The Fayum is a lush basin southwest of modern Cairo, a pocket of marshes and canals that branches off the Nile like a green thumbprint pressed into the desert. And it was there that Sobek's cult flourished, a temple center called Crocodilopolis by the Greeks, who found the whole thing a little too literal. Sobek was the Nile in its most honest form. Not the gentle inundation, not the life-giving water that Isis wept onto the fields. He was the water that kills. He was the crocodile that drifts just below the surface, eyes and nostrils the only sign of the ton of muscle and teeth gliding toward the bank. His temples kept live crocodiles, huge ones, bull-necked and patient, fed on honey cakes and choice cuts of meat, draped in jewelry, because the Egyptians had the audacity to put gold bangles on a death machine and call it reverence. When one of these sacred crocodiles died, it was mummified with the same elaborate rites as a nobleman, wrapped in linen and buried in a sarcophagus, because Sobek was not merely an animal god. He was the raw, predatory power of the river itself, the force that tore and devoured, and then, in the same motion, fertilized the banks with the blood of its prey. He was also fiercely protective. The crocodile that destroys is the same crocodile that guards its nest with a tenderness that borders on the obsessive. Sobek's followers prayed to him for safety from the very dangers of the water that he embodied. He was the patron of pharaonic might, the power that a king must wield to crush his enemies, and his image appears on temple walls with the pharaoh himself, the two of them sharing the same reptilian smile. The Nile's bounty was built on the bones of everything Sobek had ever eaten, and that made him a god of fertility as much as of terror. To worship him was to acknowledge that creation and destruction share the same jaw. That same jaw, the one that had taught the Nile to fear the surface, became something even more formidable when the priests of the Fayum decided their crocodile god needed a promotion. They fused Sobek with Ra, the sun god who was at that very moment sailing his bark through the sky and the underworld in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. The result was Sobekra, the solar crocodile. Not a metaphor, not a poetic title, but a single being who was simultaneously the predator in the reeds and the blazing sun at high noon. This fusion was audacious, even by Egyptian standards. The crocodile was not a cuddly symbol of divine benevolence. It was the thing that ate fishermen, that dragged cattle from the shallows, that haunted the darkness of every crossing. And yet, by binding Sobek to Ra, the Egyptians declared that the same ferocity that tore a wildebeest apart was the ferocity that defended the sun bark from Apophis in the Jewett. That serpent of chaos we have already met in the dark hours. The killer became the guardian. The terror became the shield. Sobekra was the ultimate argument that danger and protection are not opposites, but two expressions of the same voltage. The power that threatens chaos is the same power that safeguards cosmic order. A crocodile does not stop being a crocodile when it protects its young. It is the same muscle, the same instinct, the same crushing finality. Sobekra did not soften. He did not become a nice god. He simply expanded his portfolio to include the defense of the sun itself, a job that required teeth and no hesitation. The Egyptians looked at the most dangerous animal in their world and saw, without contradiction, the best possible choice for a bodyguard. It was the same logic that made Sekhmet both the destroyer of humanity and the protector of the pharaoh. The same logic that made Set both the murderer of Osiris and the only god capable of spearing Apophis through the throat. Dual nature was not a paradox in Egyptian theology. It was the entire point. And if the crocodile and the lioness were too much to process before bed, the Egyptians also had a goddess for that, a deity who had started as a daughter of Ra, that aging sun god whose eye had once nearly annihilated humanity in the form of a blood-soaked lioness. But unlike Sekhmet, who had remained in that form of unrelenting fury, Bastet had evolved. She softened. Not completely, never completely, because no feline goddess in Egypt ever fully gave up her claws. But she had learned to purr. Bastet began her life as a lioness, a daughter of the sun with the same burning gaze and the same capacity for slaughter. But over centuries of worship centered in the delta city of Bubastes, modern Tel Basta near Zagazig, her image transformed. The lioness became a cat. The wild hunter became the domestic companion who curled up by the hearth and caught mice in the grain stores and blinked slowly at her owners with an expression of complete, unearned satisfaction. She became the goddess of home, of fertility, of the warmth of the sun rather than its scorching heat. Music was her domain, and dance, and the kind of joy that does not come from wild abandon, but from the steady hum of a protected household. Her apotropaic function, her power to turn away evil, was woven into every amulet and statue. A Bastet figurine in the home kept disease spirits at bay, warded off the demons that caused miscarriages and fevers, and ensured that the children sleeping in their linen beds would wake in the morning. She was not gentle because she was weak. She was gentle because she had chosen to be, and everyone understood that the choice was revocable. When the situation demanded, the cat could become the lioness again, and Bastet could become Sekhmet without changing anything except the angle of her ears. The same divine voltage ran through both of them. The difference was merely how they chose to spend it. The city that hosted this ecstatic act of communal unbuttoning was Bubastes, modern Tel Basta, and the festival held there in honor of the cat goddess. That same Bastet who had softened from lioness to purring protectress was described by a Greek traveler named Herodotus with a mixture of admiration and shock. He claimed that 700,000 pilgrims arrived for the event, a number that almost certainly included the entire population of the Delta, plus a few nearby planets. But the exaggeration captured the scale of the thing. This was not a quiet temple service. This was the biggest party in Egypt, and everyone knew it. The pilgrims traveled by river, fleets of boats packed so tightly that the Nile looked like a moving city. But the journey itself was the real ceremony. As each boat passed a town, the women aboard would stand and shout mockery at the woman on the shore, and the women on the shore would shout back. Then the women on the boats would clap in rhythm, and the boat would continue on. When they reached the banks near Bubastes, the festival erupted into full voice. flutes, the rattling of sistrums, the rhythmic beating of drums, and the sound of thousands of people singing songs that would not be printed in any liturgy. The pilgrims were drunk, not just tipsy, not merely festive, but ecstatically, religiously drunk, swaying in the mud with cups of beer that never seemed to empty. This ritual drunkenness was not a lapse in piety. It was the whole point. The festival was a communal reenactment of the myth in which Hathor, that raging eye of Ra, had been pacified with red beer that mimicked the blood of her slaughtered victims. By drinking themselves into joyful stupor, the pilgrims were keeping the goddess happy, ensuring that her wrath remained a memory, and her gentle, purring face remained turned toward the world. The festival of Bastet was a safety valve, a deliberate overload, a yearly reminder that order and joy required each other, and that sometimes the way to maintain cosmic balance was to get very, very drunk on a boat while shouting at strangers. And while the boats were still swaying back from Bubestes, and the echoes of the drunken flutes were fading from the delta air, a far older goddess watched from her temple at Sais, a city in the western delta near the Rosetta branch of the Nile. Her name was Neith, and she had been ancient when Atum first coughed up Shu and Tefnut on that lonely mound. While Bastet was learning to purr and Sekhmet was washing blood from her claws, Neith was already a grandmother of the cosmos, wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, the Deseret, with a bow and 2 crossed arrows mounted on her shrine. She was a huntress, not the kind who slaughters for joy like Sekhmet, but the kind who hunts because hunting is the oldest conversation between a predator and the truth of the world. Her arrows were not merely weapons. They were stitches in the fabric she was weaving, and the fabric was existence itself. Neith was a weaver goddess, and her loom was the world. Every thread she drew through the warp was a river, a mountain, a heartbeat. The Egyptians said she wove the entire cosmos, all of it, while wearing a crown and carrying a bow, because she was not going to let the act of creation interfere with the ability to defend what she had made. Her protective power extended to the dead. She was one of the 4 goddesses who guarded the canopic jars, the containers of the viscera of the deceased, and her presence on the funerary bier was a promise that the dead would not be unspooled. In some traditions, she was the mother of Sobek, that crocodile deity of the Fayum who had become Sobekra, the solar predator. In others, she was the mother of Ra himself, which made her the mother of light. A goddess who had woven the world and then given birth to the sun was not someone you argued with. Her temple at Sais bore the inscription that summed up her entire vibe, and it is the most devastating sentence ever carved in stone. I am all that has been, and is, and shall be. No mortal has ever lifted my veil. That veil, which no mortal had ever lifted, was not a theatrical prop. It was a functional necessity. Because in some schemes of the Ogdoad, that primordial octet of frog and snake-headed deities from Hermopolis, Neith was not merely an adjunct goddess. She was the ninth, the invisible member, the Great Mother, who had spun the very waters in which the eight floated. The priests of size had the audacity to suggest that the Ogdoad needed a creator, and that creator was their goddess, sitting at her loom with her arrows propped against the wall. Her inclusion in the Ogdoadic scheme was not a demotion to primordial obscurity. It was a promotion to ultimate causality. The 8 frog-headed males and snake-headed females churned in the inert chaos, but someone had to have given them something to churn in. Neith provided the stage, the actors, and the script. She was the Great Mother who wove the entire world, and her weaving did not stop with mountains and rivers. It extended to the wrappings of the mummy. Every strip of linen that Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer who had prepared Osiris's body for eternity, and his priests wrapped around a corpse, was a thread in Neith's eternal fabric. The mummy was a loom, the body was the warp, the linen was the weft, and the final product was a soul that would not unravel. Her connection to the canopic gear, the chests and jars housing the viscera of the dead, placed her among the 4 guardian goddesses who stood watch over the sons of Horus. She guarded the stomach, and by extension, she guarded the act of consumption, the taking in of the world, the digestion of experience. And she did so with a bow in her hand. The archer goddess who wove the cosmos also guarded the dead, her arrows aimed outward into the darkness that pressed against the tomb. Her presence on the funerary bier was not decorative. It was the promise that what she had woven, no force in the jewet could unstitch. The loom of Neith wove the whole cosmos from threads of light and shadow, but a different factory was humming farther south, and the product it turned out was people. At the first cataract of the Nile, on the island of Elephantine near modern Aswan, Num sat at his potter's wheel and shaped every human child who would ever draw breath. He was a ram-headed god, his horns curling horizontally around his ears, and his workshop was not a temple in the quiet sense. It was a factory floor. Num took the black silt of the Nile, the same fertile mud the inundation left behind each year, and he molded it on his wheel into the bodies of infants. Beside each child, on the same wheel, he shaped an identical figure. The Ka, the life force double, the spiritual blueprint that would survive the body's death and journey to the Hall of Two Truths, where Anubis waited with his scale. Every pharaoh who ever touched the double crown to his brow, and every farmer's daughter who ever sang in a barley field, had been formed by the same ram-headed hands from the same river mud. His connection to the inundation was not poetic, it was mechanical. The Nile flood brought the silt, and the silt was the raw material of humanity. When the waters failed, when the black land shrank, and the red land expanded, Num's wheel slowed. The famine stele, a Ptolemaic era inscription carved onto a rock on the island of Sehel, claims that a pharaoh named Djoser, who lived more than 2,000 years before the stele was even written, dreamed of Num in a time of 7-year famine. The god appeared and scolded the king for neglecting his temple, and then promised to unleash the inundation again. The river rose, the famine broke, the wheel turned. The intimate equation was inescapable. The creator, the river, and human life were a single closed loop. Num's wheel never stopped spinning as long as the Nile obeyed its rhythm, and every birth was a small echo of the original creation. A lump of clay given breath by a craftsman who had been making humans since before the gods had names. The clay that Num shaped on his wheel did not come from nowhere, and the river that delivered it was not a mindless current. The inundation was a god. His name was Happy, and he was not the river itself, but the flood, the specific miraculous surge of water that arrived every summer without warning and without fail, turning the black land into a shallow lake, and then retreating to leave behind a carpet of wet, fertile silt. Happy was an androgynous god, a single being who contained both male and female principles, his body soft with rolls of fat that represented the abundance of the flood, and his chest hanging with the heavy breasts of a nursing mother. He wore a crown of papyrus plants and carried offerings of lotus and fish, and he was never depicted as thin. Thinness was famine. Thinness was the absence of the flood. Happy's obesity was a theological statement, and the statement was that the Nile was generous. The inundation was not caused by Happy alone. It was also the tears of Isis, the sister wife of Osiris, whose grief for her murdered husband was the mythic engine of the river's rise. When Osiris died, when Seth hacked his brother into 14 pieces and scattered him, she mourned, and her tears were so copious that they flooded the banks of the Nile. This was not a contradiction of Happy's role. It was a layering of truths. The flood was divine mechanism and divine grief simultaneously. The water that drowned the fields and then receded to reveal the black soil was the resurrection of Osiris himself, the green-skinned king whose body was the vegetation that sprouted after the waters fell. The flood destroyed boundaries, washed away markers, erased the difference between one man's field and another's, and in that destruction it brought life. The dual nature was inescapable. Happy was the giver of bread and the taker of landmarks, the soft, fat god who drowned your house and then fed your children for a year. That annual drowning was not a random event on a calendar. It was an episode in a story the Egyptians had been telling since before the pyramids were foundations, and the story had only 2 acts, death and resurrection. And the death was Osiris, the good king, the green-skinned lord who had taught humanity to farm, lay murdered in the Nile, his body scattered by Seth, that jealous brother whose chaos was necessary but never gentle. When Seth hacked the king apart, the river received the corpse, and then the tears began. Isis, the sister wife of Osiris, the throne goddess who had already begun her long work of gathering the pieces of her husband, wept with a grief so absolute that the river swelled with it. Happy, the androgynous flood god whose rolls of fat represented abundance, pushed the water over the banks. The two causes were not in competition. Her tears and his flood were the same water, rising to cover the fields. The Nile was not just flooding. It was mourning, and mourning was the mechanism of renewal. When the waters receded, they left behind the black land, Kemet, the rich dark silt that gave Egypt its name. The soil was not metaphor. It was the fertile flesh of Osiris himself, his body reconstituted as arable ground. The seeds pushed through this black mud, and the barley grew, and the wheat ripened, and the harvest was the resurrection. Every agricultural cycle was a replay of the murder, and the mourning, and the rebirth. The Egyptians were not farmers who happened to be religious. They were a people whose entire worldview was built on the observation that a dead king, properly mourned, could become a field of grain. The desert, the red land, was Seth's domain, but the black land was Osiris's body, Isis's tears, Hapi's gut, and Khnum's raw material, all layered into a single black cake of divinity. They ate it, they planted in it, they buried their dead in it, and they trusted that the rhythm would not fail, because if it failed, it meant the story had stopped, and a stopped story was the end of everything. Among those layers of divine black soil, however, between the morning and the harvest, small things could kill. The scorpion, which the Egyptians called the Werti, the Great One, was a creature that hunted in the cracks of the Fellahin's mud brick walls and under the pottery shards of kitchen floors. Its sting sent a venom through the body that burned like Sekhmet's midday sun, concentrated into a single point. And the goddess who held dominion over this venom, who could send it, and more importantly, take it away, was Serket, sometimes called Selket, the scorpion goddess. She was not a pest. She was a paradox. The scorpion's sting killed infants, yes, but Serket was the goddess who protected infants. The venom could fell a grown man, but Serket was the goddess who healed venomous bites. Her power was the power over poison itself, the magical control of a substance that could only be mastered by someone who understood it completely from the inside. She is shown with a scorpion balanced on her head, its tail arched and ready, but held in perfect stillness, a weapon at rest. Her emblem was not a threat. It was a promise of control. Her role in the Osiris myth was quiet but indispensable. She was one of the 4 divine guardians alongside Neith, that ancient weaver and huntress of sighs, Isis and Nephthys, assigned to protect the canopic jars, the sacred containers that held the viscera of the deceased. Serket guarded the jar of Kebe-Senuf, the falcon-headed son of Horus, which contained the intestines. But the image that truly fixed her in the Egyptian imagination was from the Delta marshes. When Isis, that mistress of Heka and devoted mother, hid the infant Horus in the papyrus thickets, it was Serket who surrounded the child with a hedge of scorpions, her own sacred creatures turned bodyguards. When a magical serpent bit the boy, and Isis screamed a spell that stopped the sun bark in the sky, the scorpion goddess was already there, her venom and her cure two expressions of the same divine biology. That jar, the one guarded by Circuit's scorpion stillness, was only one of four, and it belonged to a falcon-headed son of Horus named Senuv. He was not a god of fields or harvests. He was a god of preservation, a divine organ jar made animate, and he had three brothers who together formed the most literal security system in the afterlife. They were the four sons of Horus, and their names were Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Senuv. The four sons were the guardians of the soft internal parts that the embalmers removed from the body during mummification, the viscera that had to be preserved separately in canopic jars if the deceased was to rise whole in the kingdom of Osiris. Each son guarded a specific organ, faced a specific cardinal direction, and was himself protected by a goddess. The system was absurdly redundant in the way that only an eternity-obsessed civilization could create. Imseti had the head of a human, and he guarded the liver, that heavy organ of blood and filtration. He faced south, and his protectress was Isis, the mistress of Heka herself, the throne goddess whose magic had once stitched Osiris back together. Her presence over Imseti's jar was a guarantee that the liver would be received with the same power that had raised the king of the dead. Hapi had the head of a baboon, that dog-faced primate whose barking greeted the dawn, and he guarded the lungs. He faced north, and his protectress was Nephthys, the shadow companion, the sister of Isis, whose lamentations had helped restore the soul. Her presence was the promise that breath would continue in the fields of Aru. Duamutef had the head of a jackal, the same yellow-eyed scavenger that Anubis, the embalmer of Osiris, had borrowed for his own divine form. He guarded the stomach, faced east, and was protected by Neith, the ancient huntress and weaver, the primordial mother whose veil no mortal had ever lifted. Her arrows guarded his jar as her loom guarded the fabric of the cosmos. Senuv had the head of a falcon, the same bird that belonged to Horus himself, the avenger who had vindicated his father's throne. He guarded the intestines. He faced west, the direction of sunset and the entrance to the Jewett. And his protectress was Circuit, the scorpion goddess whose venom and cure were two expressions of the same command over life and death. Together in the canopic shrine, arranged around the bier with the precision of a compass, the four sons and their four goddesses ensured that the body would arrive in the afterlife whole. Nothing was left to chance. Every organ had a guardian. Every guardian had a backup. The resurrection of the body was not a miracle. It was a project, and the four sons of Horus were the project managers. The canopic shrine itself was a box of wood or stone, a miniature treasury placed in the tomb near the sarcophagus. Inside, 4 compartments held the 4 jars, each carved from alabaster or limestone, each sealed with a stopper shaped into the head of the sun who guarded it. The human-headed Imseti presided over the liver jar. The baboon-headed Hapi watched over the lungs. The jackal-headed Duamutef protected the stomach. The falcon-headed Kebe-Senuv stood sentinel over the intestines, arranged around the bier with a precision that an astronomer would envy. The jars faced their assigned directions, a compass designed not for navigation, but for resurrection. The goddesses assigned to protect them, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket, were not distant supervisors. They were present in the spells inscribed on the shrine, in the amulets tucked between the linen wrappings, in the very logic that had assigned each goddess to her son. No organ was left without a guardian, and no guardian was left without a backup. The redundancy was the theology. The Egyptians knew that resurrection was a fragile proposition, that the body had to be whole, and the name had to be remembered, and the heart had to be light, and any single point of failure could unspool the entire project. So they built a system that accounted for every contingency, a cosmic insurance policy written in linen and stone. This arrangement was not merely practical. It mirrored the cosmic pillars that held up the sky, the four corners of the world, the four directions of the wind. The body of the deceased became a microcosm of the universe. The lungs and the liver, the stomach and the intestines were not just viscera. They were the cardinal points of a private cosmos, and their regeneration in the afterlife was the final proof that the person had not been destroyed, but reassembled, their parts returned, their wholeness guaranteed by the sons of Horus and the wings of the goddesses who had never stopped watching over them. While those four goddesses guarded the jars of the dead with their wings and their spells, there was another protector entirely who had nothing to do with the dead and everything to do with the terrifying, bloody threshold of birth. Her name was Taweret, which means the Great One, and she was an upright female hippopotamus, standing on thick legs that ended in lion paws, her back dragging the tail of a crocodile through the mud of the imagination. She was not elegant. She was not the sort of goddess whose image you placed on a delicate amulet to show good taste. Taweret was a composite of the three most dangerous animals the Egyptians knew, but arranged not for predation, but for protection. The hippopotamus mother was the most ferocious defender of her young in the river, charging boats and crushing skulls to keep her calf safe. The lioness was the apex hunter who killed for her pride. The crocodile was the death that waited below the surface. And here they were, combined into a single deity who stood guard not over tombs, but over the beds of women in labor, her grotesque, terrifying appearance, a deliberate weapon aimed at the demons who caused miscarriages, stillbirths, and fever in nursing infants. Her image was everywhere in the household. She appeared on beds, on headrests, on the ivory wands that magicians used to draw protective circles around pregnant women. Her grin was wide and toothy, her belly heavy, her breasts pendulous, her expression almost comically fierce, like a bouncer who had seen every possible horror and was bored by the prospect. That grin was the point. Evil spirits, the Egyptians believed, were repelled by ugliness and laughter in equal measure. Taweret was both. she offered a fear that canceled fear, a maternal rage so potent that no demon of fever or infertility could cross the threshold she guarded. Mothers called on her. Midwives carved her likeness into amulets, and the children who survived because of her grew up in houses where the hippopotamus goddess was not a monster, but a member of the family. And if Tauret guarded the bodies of mothers with her terrifying maternal bulk, there was another protector of the household who worked a different shift, a figure so peculiar that he could only have been born from the Egyptian conviction that the safest thing in the world was a joke told at a demon's expense. His name was Bes. He was a dwarf with bandy legs, a feathered headdress, and a face split by a ferocious, tongue-protruding grin that he wore like armor. Bes was not a god imported from some distant temple or elevated by royal decree. He was the god who lived in the house. His image was carved on the legs of beds, painted on the walls of bedrooms, stitched into the pillows where sleepers laid their heads. His entire purpose was apotropaic, a word that means the power to turn away evil. He was the anti-demon, the scarecrow of the spirit world, and the principle by which he operated was simple. Evil spirits fed on misery and fear, so he offered them its opposite. He made them laugh, and laughter was their poison. He played the drum. He danced. He pulled faces and made obscene gestures that would have gotten a mortal priest dismissed from any temple. He drank beer until his grin widened, and he invited the household to join him. The Egyptians believed that nightmares were caused by demons creeping into bedrooms at night, sitting on the chests of sleepers, and whispering terrors into their ears. Bes sat at the bedside and grinned until those demons fled. He was placed particularly in the birthing chamber, often right alongside Tauret, because a woman in labor was vulnerable to every dark spirit that hungered for an easy passage into the world. Together, the hippopotamus mother and the dancing dwarf formed an unbreachable perimeter of ugly, joyful, sacred protection. That domestic joy, the grinning dwarf and the hippopotamus mother guarding the threshold of every bedroom, was a late and beautiful invention. Before any of that, before the lamplit bedrooms and the lullabies, the universe had been conceived by a city called Kemenyu, Hermopolis to the Greeks, the city of the eight. And those eight were the Ogdoad, a set of primordial deities so abstract, so impersonal, that they barely had personalities. They were principles. They were ingredients. They were the frog-headed males and snake-headed females drifting in the nun before time had learned to tick. The list is a litany. Nun and Nonnet, the god and goddess of the primordial water itself, the infinite wet dark from which everything would eventually crawl. Heh and Hohit, the god and goddess of infinity, the boundlessness that stretched in every direction with no edge, no border, no comforting wall. Kek and Kokit, the god and goddess of darkness, the absolute black that existed before anyone had the bad taste to invent light. Amun and Amunet, the god and goddess of hiddenness, the principle of being invisible and unknowable. Amun himself destined for a promotion so dramatic it would make him the king of the gods. But that was later. Here, in the Hermopolitan cosmology, he was simply one half of a pair, a frog-headed mystery floating in the soup. They existed in the inert chaos, these eight, not creating through will or emotion, or divine masturbation on a lonely mound. Their creation was a chemical reaction. Their combined energy, the pressure of their elemental natures pressing against each other, caused a stirring in the waters. From that stirring rose the primeval mound, the Benben, and upon it, or perhaps bursting from it, a cosmic egg or a blue lotus. And from that egg or lotus emerged the solar creator, the child sun, the light that would become Ra. The Ogdoad did not love. They did not speak. They simply were, and their being was enough to trigger the entire subsequent history of the cosmos. A cold, elegant, mathematical origin story that stood in stark contrast to the family dramas of Heliopolis and the intellectual pronouncements of Memphis. They were the eight, and after their work was done, they sank back into the none, their purpose fulfilled, their names still spoken in temples that honored the silence before the first word. The silence after the Ogdoad sank back into the none did not last. Nature, even divine nature, abhors a vacuum, and the primeval mound that their chemical energies had thrust up from the dark waters was not destined to remain bare. Something grew. The blue lotus, the water lily that the Egyptians called the session, pushed its stem through the wet silt and rose toward the darkness, its petals tightly closed like a fist keeping a secret. This was not a metaphor for beauty. The blue lotus had a specific biological habit that the Egyptians had observed with the kind of attention that turns botany into theology. The flower closes at night and sinks below the water. At dawn, it rises again and opens its petals. It is a plant that performs resurrection every single morning, and the Egyptians, who were never going to miss an opportunity to see the universe in a flower, understood exactly what it meant. The lotus was the first living thing, the first manifestation of order, and its petals were a door. When that door opened, there was something inside. The newborn sun god, often shown as a naked child with his finger pressed to his lips in the gesture of infancy, sat at the center of the blossom. In some tellings, this was Nefertum, that beautiful young god of perfume and healing, whose mother was Sekhmet and whose father was Ptah, the craftsman of Memphis. In other tellings, it was Ra himself, the solar disk, emerging from the lotus as a child at the first dawn, his light spilling out across the none for the very first time. The image of the solar child in the lotus became one of the most enduring symbols in Egyptian art, carved into temple walls, painted on papyrus, molded into amulets worn against the skin of the living and the dead alike. It was the promise that regeneration was not a hope, but a law. Every night the lotus closed. Every morning it opened. The child grew into the warrior sun. The warrior sun aged into the old man who died in the west. And the old man was reborn as the child in the petals again. a loop that nothing, not even Apophis the serpent of uncreation, whose throat Seth regularly speared, could break. The lotus cycle that nothing could break was not the only thing the Egyptians refused to see as a contradiction. By now, anyone paying attention would have noticed that the Egyptians had at least 4 different creation stories, each from a different temple, each claiming exclusive priority. Atum created himself on a mound in Heliopolis and spat out the first gods. Ta thought the world into being and spoke it aloud in Memphis. The Ogdoad churned in the Hermopolitan waters until their pressure hatched a solar egg. Amun was the hidden, transcendent mind behind everything, and the Thebans insisted he had always been there. A logical mind might ask which one was true. The Egyptian mind asked why they could not all be true. The answer was syncretism, which is a clinical-sounding word for a very unsanitary but brilliant process. Syncretism meant merging deities without eradicating them. Amun and Ra did not fight for supremacy. They became Amun-Ra, the hidden sun, the invisible visible, each half making the other more complete. Sobek, the crocodile predator, was fused with Ra and became Sobek-Ra, the solar crocodile who defended the bark he once might have capsized. Ta, the craftsman of Memphis, was merged with Sakar, the hawk-headed god of the necropolis, and with Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the dead, and became Ta-Sakar Osiris, a triple-layered deity of creation, death, and resurrection. The gods did not cancel each other out. They layered like sediment on the bed of the inundation, each flood adding a new deposit of meaning to the same river. This theological flexibility was not a flaw in the Egyptian religious system. It was the entire point. Multiple creation stories were not competing dogmas. They were different camera angles on the same event, each one revealing something the others obscured. The Heliopolitan model gave you family drama and emotional stakes. The Memphite model gave you intellectual elegance. The Hermopolitan model gave you elemental physics. The Theban model gave you invisible transcendence. A worshipper could pray to all of them without mental strain, because the system was designed to accommodate what modern minds might call contradictory truths, and what the Egyptians simply called the many faces of the divine. This fluidity unified the country, wove local loyalties into a national fabric, and allowed a village crocodile cult and the high priests of Thebes to participate in the same cosmic conversation. The polytheistic system was not a zoo of rival gods. It was a woven thing, a loom like Neith's, each thread a different color, but all of them holding the cloth together. The loom held. It had held for 2,000 years, through every invasion, every dynasty, every foolish king who thought he could pull a single thread without unraveling the whole cloth. And then a pharaoh named Akhenaten took a knife to it. He was born Amenhotep IV, but the name he chose for himself erased his father's god. Akhenaten meant effective for the Aten, and the Aten was not a god with a ram's head or a falcon's face. It was the solar disk itself, the plain golden circle the light that arrived without mythology. No bark, no crew, no serpent battle, just heat and radiance. This was not Ra. This was not Amun-Ra. This was the light stripped of story, and Akhenaten declared it the only god that had ever existed. He did not argue with the other priests. He did not debate theology in the halls of Thebes. He built a new capital from scratch on a stretch of desert that is now called Tel El Amarna, a city deliberately placed where no other god had ever been worshipped, and he moved the entire court there. The walls of this city, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, were carved with images no Egyptian had ever seen before. The royal family was shown with elongated skulls, distended bellies, spindly arms, kissing their children, holding hands, bathing in the rays of the Aten that ended in tiny hands offering the ankh of life to their nostrils. The art was intimate, strange, and deliberately broken from every convention that had governed Egyptian aesthetics since the first pyramid. The message was clear. The old ways were over. The suppression of Amun was systematic. Akhenaten sent agents to chisel out the name of Amun from temple walls, to close the great temple of Karnak, to divert the wealth that had flowed to the Amun priesthood for centuries directly into the Aten's empty, open-air sanctuaries. This was not syncretism. This was not a layering of divine identities. This was monotheism, or perhaps monolatry, the worship of one god while acknowledging others might exist, but declaring them irrelevant. The theological break was absolute, and the social upheaval was devastating. An entire class of priests was disenfranchised. The elaborate funerary industry, the spells, the amulets, the canopic jars guarded by the sons of Horus, all of it became suddenly unnecessary if the Aten alone provided light and life, and no judgment awaited the dead in a hall of two truths. The movement died with Akhenaten. His son, Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, the name everyone now knows, and abandoned the horizon of the Aten. The old gods returned. The chiseled names were recarved. The temples reopened. Within a generation, Akhenaten's city was empty, his name erased from king lists, his memory a wound the priests of Amun allowed to scar over, but never to heal. The loom had held, but the knife had left a mark, and the whisper of the heretic king, who had tried to reduce the universe to a single disk of light, never quite faded from the desert air. The restoration began before the heretic's body was cold, though the Egyptians would never have described it that way. They would have said mad, that cosmic principle of truth and balance for which the feather of justice was the only true measure, was being restored. And the restorer-in-chief was a boy of about 9 years old. His name was Tutankhamun, though he had been born Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. Changing a name was not cosmetic surgery in ancient Egypt. It was an ontological renovation. The boy king issued the restoration stela, a great slab of stone inscribed with the admission that the gods had abandoned Egypt. The temples were in ruin. The prayers had stopped. The army had lost battles it should have won. All because the heretic king had silenced the names. Tutankhamun restored those names. He reopened the temples. He refilled the priesthoods, restocked the grain stores, recommissioned the statues. Amun's name returned to Karnak, which is in modern Luxor, with a vengeance. The wealth of the empire poured back into the gods' coffers, and the boy king, who would die at around 18 and be buried in a tomb so small and hurried that it would be the only royal burial in the Valley of the Kings to escape the tomb robbers and become the most famous archaeological discovery in history, was revered as the pharaoh who had undone the chaos of his father. But the real hammer of the Counter-Reformation was Hormheb. He was not a priest. He was a general who had served in the army under Akhenaten and now took the throne as pharaoh. Hormheb, the outline suggests, systematically dismantled Amarna's legacy with the cold precision of a military campaign. He ordered the heretic city at Akhetaten razed, its stones quarried for other buildings, its name forgotten. He erased Akhenaten's name from official king lists, striking it from monuments as though the heretic had never existed. His agents chiseled the Aten's disk from temple walls. His scribes backdated his own reign to the death of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, as though the entire Amarna period was a clerical error that could be corrected with enough ink and chisels. The traditional polytheism that survived was not a fragile thing. It had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. Amun-Ra, that hidden sun fusion who had been the king of the gods since the Theban priests first wove their theology, was once again supreme. The pantheon breathed. The temples hummed with offerings. The dead journeyed through the Jewet with their spells intact. The heresy of the soul disk was remembered only as a wound, a warning, a proof that the gods did not need a single name to be real. They just needed their names to be spoken, and the Restoration Stela had spoken them all. The Restoration Stela had spoken all the gods' names back into the air, but long before a single chisel touched a single temple wall. The reason the gods had needed their names spoken at all was already written in a much older myth. It was the myth of the heavenly cow, and it began where the destruction of mankind ended. Ra, the aging sun, had just saved a remnant of humanity from Sekhmet's slaughter by flooding a field with red beer, and he had decided he was finished. Not angry, not vengeful, just exhausted. The creatures he had made had plotted against him, laughed at his drooping jaw, and forced him to drug his own daughter to stop her from erasing the species. He wanted out. The sky goddess Nut, who had been the starry vault arched over the earth ever since her father Shu pried her apart from her lover Jeb, now took a different form. She became a colossal cow, her belly the blue of the day sky, her hide speckled with the stars that would later decorate all her temple ceilings. Ra climbed onto her back. As Nut rose, she lifted him away from the earth, and the gap between the divine and the human opened wide. heaven separated from the mortal world. The sun became a distant disk, not a god who walked among the fields. From that height, Ra delegated. He put Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe who had already gambled moonlight from Khonsu, to create the 5 epigonal days, in charge of the night sky. He assigned other gods their duties, and he set the final, unappealable limits on human life. Suffering, toil, the certainty of death, all of it became the permanent condition of existence, not because the gods hated humanity, but because they had withdrawn, and distance always breeds hardship. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, which records this myth, is not a comfort. It is a philosophical document about the gulf between mortals and the divine, and its final message is that the gods are not coming back. They are up there, on the back of a starry cow, and we are down here, with nothing but our own names to speak. The distance Ra had imposed from the back of the heavenly cow did not mean the gods had stopped feeling. And the most dangerous emotion they could feel, it turned out, was not rage, but homesickness disguised as rage. The distant goddess myth, which the Egyptians told in several versions, always began the same way. The Eye of Ra, that feminine power of protection and destruction, that same divine fire that had once taken the form of Sekhmet and nearly erased humanity before the red beer tricked her into a drunken stupor, decided she had had enough. In some tellings, she was Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and mist, who had been one of the first pair coughed up by Atum on the primeval mound. In others, she was Hathor, the golden goddess of love and music, who had also shown herself capable of becoming the raging eye. The name changed depending on the temple, but the pattern was fixed. She fled. She went south, past the cataracts, into Nubia, which is modern Sudan, a land the Egyptians regarded as both a source of gold and a source of chaos. She roamed the burning hills in the form of a lioness, or perhaps a wild cat, her heat so intense that the desert cracked beneath her paws. And while she was gone, Egypt suffered. The inundation faltered. The crops withered. Music stopped. The temples grew dark. Ra, missing his daughter with the ache of a father who had not realized what he had until it was gone, knew he could not simply command her return. She was the eye. She did not obey. She had to be coaxed. The god sent to coax her was Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe who had already solved the calendar by gambling moonlight from Khonsu, that moon god who had lost 5 days of light in a Senate game. Ra chose Thoth not for his strength, but for his patience and his words. Thoth transformed himself into a baboon, the other animal sacred to him, and traveled south. He found the raging goddess in the desert and did not command her. He told her stories. He told her fables of the animals, riddles, jokes, the kind of rambling, wise, patient talk that wears down fury not by argument, but by the simple persistence of a calm voice against heat. He told her that Egypt was dark without her, that her father was sorry, that the Nile had shrunk. She listened. Her rage cooled. When she returned, she did so joyfully. Her progress north was a parade of music and drunkenness, the first festival, the first inundation of the year, the first promise that estrangement was not final. The cycle of the distant goddess was the mythic engine of every Egyptian festival that involved music, intoxication, and the return of spring. It was the story that explained why the world sometimes went dark, and why the darkness was always broken by a goddess coming home. And when the music of that return reached its loudest note, when the flutes and the sistrums were still ringing from the festival, the next sound to follow was often a child's first cry. Because Hathor, in all her forms, did not just preside over drunkenness and the sunrise. She also presided over the moment a soul entered the world. And she did not do it alone. She had 7 aspects, 7 faces, 7 voices that appeared together at the bedside of every woman in labor. They were the 7 Hathors, sky goddesses who arrived not to comfort, but to decree. As the infant took its first breath, these 7 identical figures, cow-eared and serene, leaned over the cradle and spoke the child's destiny in a single, unalterable sentence. The day of death, the manner of death, the spouse, the children, the wound that would finally close the story. It was not a blessing. It was a diagnosis, delivered with the detached calm of beings who had seen every possible human life unspool before them, and were not impressed by any of them. They were the original blueprint for every fairy godmother who ever leaned over a cradle with a prophecy, except these godmothers did not soften the blow with rhymes. The most famous example comes from the tale of the doomed prince, a story preserved on a single papyrus. The Hathors appear at his birth and declare that he will die by a crocodile, a snake, or a dog. His father builds him a tower to keep the fates at bay, which works about as well as towers ever work in mythology. The prince grows up, marries, and the papyrus breaks off just as the 3 fates are closing in. The ending is lost, but the point had already been made. The 7 Hathors were the embodiment of Hathor's broader mantle of motherhood, music, and the final, undeniable truth that every cradle contains a grave. Their pronouncements were not punishments. They were just the facts. The facts the 7 Hathors pronounced were not the only divine words a mortal might hear. For the Egyptians, the gods did not merely speak from the sky or from the shadows of the temple sanctuary. Sometimes a god walked, not in a vision, not in a dream, but on 4 legs in the courtyard, breathing, eating, and occasionally receiving the kind of pampering that would embarrass a modern pet. The Egyptians called this a ba, a manifestation, a living image of the divine on earth. The most famous of these was the Apis bull, the living herald of Ptah, the craftsman god of Memphis, whose tongue had spoken the entire universe into being. This bull was not a metaphor. He was housed in the temple complex, attended by priests who interpreted his every twitch and breath as an oracle. He had to be black with a white triangle on his forehead and the mark of a scarab on his tongue. When he died, he was mummified with the rites of a pharaoh and buried in the Serapeum at Saqqara, a vast underground gallery of stone sarcophagi. Then the search for his successor began, a calf bearing the same sacred marks, and the cycle of divine embodiment continued without a gap. There were others. The Nevis bull was the Ba of Ra, that aging sun god who had withdrawn to the back of the heavenly cow. He was kept at Heliopolis, modern Cairo's northeastern suburbs, and his oracles were consulted on matters of state. The Bacchae's bull belonged to Montu, a war god of the Theban region, and was kept at Arment, a town south of Luxor. The ram of Mendes in the delta was the Ba of the ram-headed creator Khnum, that potter who shaped humanity on his wheel, though in Mendes the ram was also identified with the soul of Osiris, because syncretism never took a day off. These animals were not worshipped as gods in their own right. They were the vessels, the temporary houses of a divine spark. Treating them well was not sentimentality. It was cosmic maintenance, a tangible link between the human and divine realms that bleated and lowed, and occasionally knocked over an offering table. But the Ba that animated a bull in a temple courtyard was only the most public face of a far more private assembly. Every human being, the Egyptians believed, was a composite creature, a fragile coalition of parts that had to be kept together through ritual and will. Death did not automatically grant immortality. Death was a crisis of disassembly, and if the pieces did not reunite, the person simply ceased. The Ka was the life force, the double, the energy that made a living body different from a corpse. Khnum, the ram-headed potter, shaping humanity on his wheel at the source of the Nile, created the Ka alongside the body from the same lump of clay. The Ka needed food, water, and offerings, even after death, which is why tomb chapels were stocked with bread and beer. Starving a Ka was a form of murder that crossed the boundary between worlds. The Ba was the personality, the mobility, the part of the self that could travel. It is often depicted as a bird with a human head, perched on the mummy or fluttering out of the tomb to visit the sunlight. The Ba was hungry for experience, for reunion with the body, for the chance to fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It was not a peaceful ghost. It was an active, anxious, desiring thing. The Ak was the transfigured spirit, the final state of a soul that had been properly prepared, properly buried, and properly justified. To become an Ak was to join the company of the gods, to shine among the imperishable stars on Nut's belly, to have power and effectiveness in the next world. This was the goal. Everything else was maintenance. The Shut was the shadow, that dark companion that never left your side in life and could be swallowed by demons in death if not protected. The Wren was the name, which had to be spoken, carved, remembered, because a forgotten name was a forgotten soul. And the Ib was the heart, the organ that would be weighed by Anubis with his scale against the feather of Mad, while Thoth, in his ibis-headed wisdom, recorded the result. All these parts had to unite, sustained by offerings and spells, And the Ba's ability to travel between tomb and heavens was the central miracle of the Egyptian afterlife. The body lay wrapped in the darkness of the sarcophagus, but the Ba could fly up through the false door of the tomb into the sunlight to breathe, to taste, to remember. And every evening it had to return. The Ba returned to the tomb because that was where the body lay, and the body, wrapped and still, could not speak, could not eat, could not breathe. It was a perfect replica of life, but it was not alive, and the spells carved on the tomb walls could only do so much from the outside. Someone had to open the door. The ceremony was called the opening of the mouth, and it was the single most important ritual performed on the dead. The Sem priest, often wearing the leopard skin of a funerary officiant, stood before the mummy, or the statue that represented the deceased. He was not merely a man. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed avenger who had vindicated his father Osiris against the usurper Set, and now stood in every funerary chapel as the guarantor that a son's duty could resurrect a father. In his hands were ritual adzes, sacred implements shaped like a carpenter's tool, and a peseshkef, a flint blade shaped like a fish's tail, a tool so ancient its original purpose was already forgotten by the time the pyramids were built. He touched these instruments to the lips of the mummy, to the eyes, to the ears, to the nostrils. Each touch was a command. Open. The mouth opened so that the deceased could speak the spells of the Book of the Dead. Eat the offerings of bread and beer. Breathe the sweet air of the Jewat. The eyes opened so the deceased could see Ra's bark sailing through the darkness and recognize the faces of the gods. The ears opened so the deceased could hear the acclamation of the blessed dead and the hymns of the priests who would continue to sing his name in the temple above. This was not magic in the abstract. It was a surgical reanimation, a restoration of the senses that death had stolen. The mythic model for this ceremony was the embalming of Osiris himself. When Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, had wrapped the murdered king's body, when Isis and Nephthys had wailed their kite lamentations, Horus had performed the same rite on his father. He had touched his father's mouth and restored his ability to speak in the afterlife. Every opening of the mouth ceremony that followed was an echo of that filial duty. The priest was Horus. The mummy was Osiris. The act was the final stage of the transformation that turned a corpse into a living Ba, a breathing Ak, a soul that could walk among the gods and never be silent again. The voice that could now speak, the mouth that Horus had opened with his ritual adze, belonged to a soul who would wake in a cosmos whose final shape had been decided long before the first mummy was ever wrapped. That shape was recorded in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, and it was not a comforting bedtime story. It was the last word on why the world hurts. Ra, that aging sun who had withdrawn from the earth on the back of Nut, the sky goddess who had become a colossal cow to lift him into the heavens, did not simply go. He left instructions. He left a structure. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, preserved in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, explains what happened after the destruction of mankind, after the red beer, after the slaughter and the regret. Ra's weariness had curdled into a final decision. He would no longer walk among mortals. He would no longer intervene. He would separate heaven from earth permanently, and he would delegate. He summoned Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, who had already gambled moonlight from Khonsu to create the 5 epigonal days, who had soothed the distant goddess with stories in the Nubian desert, who would one day stand beside Anubis and record the weighing of every heart. Ra put Thoth in charge of the night sky. He assigned him as the vizier of the moon, the secretary of the stars, the one who would maintain order while Ra himself was absent in the dark hours. Other gods received their assignments. The universe became a bureaucracy, and then Ra imposed the final cosmic limits. He set the human lifespan. He set the measure of suffering. He decreed that toil would be the permanent condition of mortal existence, that disease and hunger and the ache of muscle after labor would not be temporary punishments, but the baseline experience of being alive. The gods, Ra declared, would no longer walk in the fields. The distance between heaven and earth was now absolute. The heavenly cow stood on her 4 legs, which were the 4 pillars of the sky, and the stars were her belly, and the sun god rode on her back, remote, untouchable, a memory of warmth rather than warmth itself. The Book of the Heavenly Cow is philosophy wearing a mythic mask. It is the Egyptian answer to the question of why the innocent suffer and why prayers go unanswered. The gods are not cruel. They are simply no longer here in the way they once were. The gulf is real. The silence from the stars is not a punishment, but a structural fact. And the only thing left for mortals is mad, that cosmic principle of truth and balance, whose feather would one day weigh every heart. Not a gift from the sky, but a responsibility on the ground.